Hi guys, tonight we slip quietly into a winter evening in the 1800s where the last light drains out of the trees and your small log cabin becomes the entire world. You are standing just inside the door, stamping cold from your boots, listening as the forest settles into a darker rhythm. The fire is alive for now, breathing softly, and the smell of smoke clings to your clothes and hair. Outside, the woods stretch farther than your mind wants to follow, layered with snow shadow and things that move when you are not looking. You probably will not survive this night in the way modern comfort teaches survival. There is no glass thick enough to shut the wilderness out, no switch to flood the dark with light, just wood fire breath and the thin comfort of routine. And yet this is where you lie down to sleep. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is where you are right now. Now dim the lights. The door closes with a dull thud that feels louder than it should. You slide the wooden bar into place, not because it would stop much, but because the act itself is calming. It gives your hands something to do. The cabin creaks as the temperature drops, logs tightening against each other with soft complaints. You know this sound. Everyone here does. It is the voice of shelter doing its best. As you move toward the hearth, a fact settles in that people of the time understood without ever saying aloud. Most frontier cabins in the 1800s were built quickly, often by families themselves, using green wood that would shrink and warp as it dried. That meant gaps. Not dramatic holes you could see daylight through, but thin seams that let cold air slide in, carrying every sound from outside with it. Tonight those seams will matter. You lay out bedding near the fire, not too close, not too far. Blankets smell faintly of wool and smoke and something animal that never quite washes out. The floor beneath you is packed earth, hard as stone, pulling warmth downward. Even before you lie down, you can feel the cold climbing patient and steady as if the ground itself is awake and listening. Then it happens. The sound does not arrive all at once. It begins as a thread, a long note stretching thin between the trees. It rises, wavers, and then gathers strength. A howl, not sharp, not aggressive, just present. It rolls across the landscape and presses gently against the cabin walls. Your body reacts before your thoughts catch up. Muscles tighten, breath pauses. You listen harder than you meant to. This is one of those moments people later romanticize, but in the moment, it is deeply practical. You are measuring distance, direction, meaning. Wolves were common across much of North America in the early 1800s, especially in wooded and frontier regions where human settlement was still sparse. That is a simple historical truth quietly accepted by the people who lived here. They did not call it wildlife management or ecosystem balance. They called it neighbors you did not invite. A quirky detail that often surprises modern listeners is that many frontier families could identify individual wolves by sound, not by sight, by voice. Certain howls were recognized the way you might recognize a neighbor's laugh through a wall. That familiarity did not make the sound comforting, but it did make it specific. Less monster, more presence. You shift on your bedding, listening as the howl fades and another answers it farther away. The space between them feels larger than the cabin, larger than your sense of safety. Sound behaves differently at night, especially in winter. Snow absorbs some noise, but cold air carries others farther, bending them, stretching them, making distances hard to judge. What sounds close may be far, what sounds far may not be. There has long been disagreement among scholars about how dangerous wolves truly were to sleeping settlers. Some argue attacks were extremely rare and exaggerated by fear and folklore. Others point to scattered records and oral histories suggesting real incidents that never made it into official documents. Historians still argue whether the danger was physical, psychological, or some uneasy blend of both. As you lie here, that debate feels academic in the least comforting way possible. Inside the cabin, the fire pops softly. Sparks lift and vanish. Someone nearby clears their throat, pretending it was nothing. No one speaks. Words would only sharpen the edges of what everyone already knows. You are not alone in your fear, and somehow that helps. Shared silence is its own kind of blanket. Your eyes adjust to the dimness. Shadows cling to corners. Tools lean against the wall, where you can reach them if needed. An axe, a long stick, and objects meant for work, not defense, but tonight they sit close anyway. Not because they would stop a wolf, but because having them nearby makes your hands feel less empty. Another howl drifts in, lower this time, almost conversational. You notice how it rises and falls, how it does not sound angry. Wolves howl to communicate location, to gather, to maintain bonds within the pack. That knowledge does not erase fear, but it reshapes it. You are not being announced as prey. You are simply part of the landscape tonight, a warm, breathing thing, tucked into the edge of their world. The smell of smoke thickens as the fire settles. Your eyelids grow heavy despite yourself. Exhaustion is a powerful ally. You tell yourself a small truth that frontier families relied on night after night. Wolves are cautious. They avoid enclosed spaces filled with human noise and fire, most of the time. That last part hangs in your mind longer than it should. Most of the time is not the same as always. Still, your breathing slows, the cabin holds, the howls move on, or at least change direction. You begin to drift balanced between listening and sleeping, between fear and the deep pull of rest. The night is not over, but for now you are still here, wrapped in wood and flame, and shared silence, learning what it meant to fall asleep, while the wild spoke just beyond the walls. The cabin does not go quiet after you lie down. It never really does. It only shifts its sounds into something slower, more intimate. Wood contracts with faint ticks. The fire exhales. Somewhere above you, snow loosens from the roof and slides away with a soft sigh. These noises would fade into nothing if you were truly safe, but tonight they feel amplified, as if the walls themselves are listening alongside you. You turn slightly, pressing your shoulder deeper into the bedding. The blankets are thin by modern standards, layered more from habit than confidence. Each one carries a different texture. Coarse wool scratches your skin. A softer inner layer smells faintly of lye soap and old smoke. Comfort here is never perfect. It is negotiated. This is where the reality of frontier construction settles in. Cabins like this were designed to be fast shelters, not soundproof fortresses. Logs were stacked horizontally and notched at the corners, then packed with a mixture of clay, moss, mud, or whatever could be gathered nearby. This filling, called chinking, shrank and cracked as it dried. Even when freshly repaired, it allowed air to pass through in narrow, wandering paths. Sound travelled the same way. A wolf did not need to be close to feel present. The cabin itself carried the message. A lesser-known but well-documented detail is that many families stuffed spare cloth rags or even dried grasses into these cracks during winter nights. Not to block cold completely, which was impossible, but to soften the noise. The idea was not silence, it was dulling, turning sharp sounds into something less defined. Fear, after all, feeds on clarity. You listen now to the wind brushing the outer walls. It slips through seams you cannot see, tracing invisible lines across your face and neck. Cold air smells different than warm air, cleaner, sharper. It carries the forest with it, pine, damp bark, something animal that might be real or might be your mind filling in gaps. You shift again and notice how the floor pulls heat away from you. Many cabins rested directly on the ground without raised foundations. This meant the earth itself became a slow, constant drain. People learned quickly to pile bedding higher, to create layers of trapped air beneath their bodies. Even so, cold always won eventually. It just took longer some nights than others. As you lie there, you realize how thin the barrier truly is between inside and out. A wall of logs, perhaps 8 inches thick, mud and moss pressed into seams. No insulation in the modern sense. No sealed windows. Sometimes not even glass, just wooden shutters pulled tight. This knowledge is not frightening on its own. It is simply factual. But facts feel different at night. Another howl rises, carried cleanly through the cracks. It does not sound muffled. It sounds filtered, as if the cabin has stripped away everything unnecessary and delivered the pure shape of the sound directly to you. Long, layered, alive. People often imagine wolves throwing themselves at cabin walls, teeth bared, claws scraping. That image comes later from stories retold by firelight and exaggeration. In reality, wolves were cautious to a fault. They avoided unfamiliar structures, especially those that smelled strongly of humans and fire. Most of the time, they kept their distance, observing rather than approaching. That was the mainstream understanding among settlers, even if they did not phrase it so calmly. Still, not everyone agreed on how safe these wolves truly were. Some accounts describe wolves circling cabins, pacing just beyond the reach of light, drawn by livestock or waste left too close to shelter. Others insist such stories were rare and inflated by long nights and longer memories. Scholars continue to debate how often wolves actually tested human boundaries versus how often humans projected fear onto unseen movement. Historians still argue whether the cabin was a genuine line of defense or more of a psychological one. You breathe slowly, letting the argument drift without resolution. Tonight is not about certainty, it is about endurance. Inside, someone shifts nearby. A blanket rustles. The sound reassures you in a quiet way. Shared presence matters more than walls. Humans are social sleepers, even when they pretend otherwise. Knowing another body is awake listening too spreads the weight of vigilance. Your eyes trace the dark shapes of the interior. Tools hang from wooden pegs. A pot rests near the hearth, blackened from years of use. Everything here serves a purpose, and nothing is wasted. That efficiency extends to fear as well. There is no room for panic. Panic burns energy. Energy equals heat. Heat equals life. A strange, almost humorous thought crosses your mind. In some frontier communities, people believed wolves could count the number of humans inside a cabin by listening to breathing. It was a fringe belief, passed around with half smiles and raised eyebrows, never fully trusted, but never fully dismissed. The idea was that if a wolf sensed weakness or solitude, it might grow bolder. So people coughed, deliberately shifted, loudly, made small human noises into the night, not to scare the wolves but to announce abundance. You consider this now and almost smile in the dark. Whether true or not, the belief itself served a purpose. It gave people something to do with their fear, something active, something human. Outside, the howls change pattern. Fewer voices now, shorter calls. You imagine movement through snowheads, lifting ears turning. Wolves communicate constantly, and their night is busy in ways yours is not. That thought oddly is calming. You are not the focus, you are simply nearby. Your breathing deepens. The cold remains, but it has become familiar, less sharp. The cabin continues its quiet conversation, with the nightwood answering windfire, answering cold. You let your awareness soften around the edges. Sleep does not arrive all at once. It seeps in thin and uneven like warmth, spreading slowly from the hearth. You drift, wake, drift again. Each time you surface, the world is unchanged. The walls still stand, the wolves still exist, and you are still here, learning how thin protection can be, and how sometimes thin is enough. Sleep almost takes you, and then the sound returns. It arrives differently this time, closer in tone, even if not in distance. A single voice rises steadier than before, less wandering. The howl stretches long enough that you feel it vibrate lightly in your chest, the way a deep bell does. Your eyes open without effort. You do not sit up. You already know better than that. This is the moment when imagination becomes a companion you did not invite. In the dark, your mind begins to build pictures without asking permission. A pale shape moving between trunks, steam lifting from fur with every breath, yellow eyes catching a sliver of starlight. You do not know if any of this is real, but your body behaves as if it might be. The truth most settlers understood, even if they never phrased it academically, was that wolves were rarely silent hunters. They announced themselves constantly. Howling was not a prelude to attack, it was communication. Packs used sound to keep track of one another across long distances, especially at night when visibility vanished. This was a common historical reality on the frontier, where sound often carried farther than sight. And yet lying here, Her knowledge does not automatically bring calm. Fear does not respond to logic on a schedule. You focus on the details you can control. The fire still glows through the lower now, casting a dim orange pulse across the ceiling. Shadows move lazily with each shift of flame. The smell of smoke is steady. These are signs of continuity. Continuity means survival. Another sound follows the howl. Not a call this time, but movement. A soft crunch, then another. Snow being disturbed. You cannot tell how close it is. Snow plays tricks on the ear, absorbing some sounds while amplifying others. A step 50 yards away can sound like one taken just beyond the wall. You remind yourself of something people learned early in wolf country. Wolves are curious, but they're also deeply cautious. They investigate from a distance. They circle. They test the air with their noses long before they test anything with their bodies. Most encounters ended with nothing more than watchful shadows and lingering noise. Still, your muscles remain tight. Fear has a way of lingering, even when danger does not advance. There is a peculiar historical detail that rarely makes it into tidy retellings. Some frontier families swore that wolves were more active around cabins during extreme cold, not because they were hunting humans, but because human activity altered the environment. Livestock produced heat, waste attracted smaller animals attracted predators. Cabins became strange warm islands in a frozen landscape, not targets but points of interest. You lie very still now, listening. Another howl answers the first, farther off, thinner. The two sounds overlap briefly, then separate. You imagine invisible lines connecting them through the forest threads of sound stitching the darkness together. People later described nights like this as terrifying, but that word is too loud for what you feel now. This is quieter, denser, a pressure rather than a panic. Your fear does not shout, it hums. Someone nearby shifts and exhales slowly, deliberately. You follow the rhythm, letting your own breathing match it. This is not a coincidence. Humans have always synchronized under stress, unconsciously seeking shared pace. It is an old instinct, older than cabins, older than stories. A small, almost amusing thought surfaces uninvited but persistent. There was a belief among some settlers that wolves disliked the sound of steady human breathing. The idea was that rhythmic, confident breath signaled health and numbers. Whether this belief had any basis in animal behavior is unclear, but it influenced how people acted. They breathed loudly on purpose. They hummed softly. They refused to hide their presence completely. You consider testing this now, but decide against it. Silence feels safer tonight, or maybe that is just habit speaking. The debate over wolves and human danger has never fully settled. Some researchers suggest that pre-modern wolf populations were more aggressive due to scarcity and competition. Others argue that wolves avoided humans consistently, and that most reported attacks were cases of rabies or extreme circumstance. Historians still argue whether the frontier fear of wolves was grounded in experience or amplified by isolation and exhaustion. Lying here, the argument feels less important than the sensation of listening. The sounds outside shift again, movement recedes, or perhaps it simply changes direction. The forest never stays still. It rearranges itself constantly, branches creaking snow, settling animals crossing unseen paths. Your mind tries to track it all, then slowly gives up. You notice how tired you are. Not the clean tiredness of a long day, but the heavy layered kind that comes from vigilance, from holding awareness too tightly for too long. This is the exhaustion that eventually overrides fear, not by resolving it, but by folding it into the background. Your eyelids lower, you allow them to stay that way, a moment longer than before. The howl does not return immediately. Instead, there is a stretch of quiet so complete it feels deliberate. Even the fire seems to pause, as if listening too. In this stillness, you remember a simple truth that frontier families learned through repetition. Wolves did not want confrontation. Injury meant death for them. Humans, for all their vulnerability, were unpredictable, loud and dangerous in groups. The cabin, thin as it was, represented complexity, fire, noise, scent, Too many unknowns. The cold seeps deeper into the space, but it is familiar now. It no longer shocks, it simply exists, a constant companion. You pull the blanket closer without lifting your head, conserving warmth, conserving motion. Outside, the night continues its quiet negotiations. Whatever interest the wolves had begins to drift elsewhere, drawn by scents and sounds that do not involve you. Their world is large, larger than this clearing, larger than your fear. Sleep returns not all at once, but in fragments that begin to connect. Images blur at the edges. The sound of breathing becomes distant. The forest fades into an abstract presence, no longer sharp enough to demand attention. You do not know how long this calm will last. You do not need to. For now the howls have softened into memory, and memory is easier to carry than sound. The cabin holds, the fire endures, and you slip deeper into rest, aware that danger exists, but comfort fragile and temporary exists, too. Time loosens its grip in the dark. Minutes stretch, then collapse, and you lose track of how long you have been lying still listening. The cabin feels smaller now, not because the walls have moved, but because your attention has narrowed. Everything outside those logs becomes louder by contrast, even when it is quiet. You turn your head slightly and notice the way the firelight barely reaches the far wall. It leaves parts of the room untouched pools of shadow that feel deeper than they should. Your eyes trace familiar shapes, the outline of a bench, the hanging curve of a kettle hook, the soft heap of supplies stacked with care. Familiarity steadies you. The mind relaxes when it can name things. What unsettles you is not what you see, but what you cannot. Wolves occupy that invisible space with ease. People who lived through these nights understood that the animals themselves were not supernatural, yet stories clung to them anyway. Over generations, wolves absorbed every fear associated with wilderness hunger and winter. They became symbols long before they became threats. There is a grounded reality beneath the stories. In the 1800s, wolves shared territory with expanding settlements across much of North America. As forests were cut and game patterns changed, wolves adapted, sometimes skirting closer to human activity than before. That shift created tension, not because wolves suddenly sought people, but because boundaries blurred. This was common knowledge among frontier families, even if it was never written down neatly. Still, exaggeration bloomed easily in isolation. Long nights encourage the mind to wander, and when it wanders, it often finds fear waiting. A single howl could turn into a pack. A rustle could become intense, retelling sharpened edges. By morning, the story grew teeth. You remember hearing that wolves never howled near prey, that they stalked silently. It was a comforting idea, but not entirely accurate. Wolves vocalize often, even when hunting, coordinating movements and maintaining contact. Silence, in truth, meant nothing specific. Neither did noise. The uncertainty was the hardest part. Your breathing slows again as you listen to the quiet between sounds. The forest seems to be holding itself in balance. Somewhere something moves, but it is distant enough to feel abstract. Distance changes fear. It turns it from immediate to theoretical. An odd frontier belief drifts through your thoughts, one that never quite faded despite lack of proof. Some settlers claimed wolves avoided cabins where laughter had recently been heard. Not shouting, not noise, but human laughter. The idea was that it signaled confidence and community. Whether wolves noticed or not, the belief encouraged people to speak lightly before bed, to tell small jokes, to remind one another that fear was shared. It was less about wolves and more about morale. You imagine the sound of laughter now and almost smile. It feels out of place in this hush, but the thought itself warms you slightly. Humour has always been a quiet survival tool. There has never been the full agreement among researchers about how often wolves actually tested human shelters. Records are inconsistent. Diaries mention nights of watching and listening far more often than nights of confrontation. Some experts suggest this means danger was overstated. Others argue it reflects successful deterrence rather than absence of threat. The discussion remains open, layered with uncertainty and regional variation. From your place on the floor, the distinction feels thin. The cabin creaks softly as the temperature shifts again. Wood responds to cold with sound tightening and releasing in tiny increments. You feel it through your back, a faint vibration that reminds you the structure is alive in its own way. Shelter is not static. It is an ongoing negotiation with the elements. You pull the blanket higher, careful not to disturb too much air. Movement wastes warmth. That lesson was learned quickly in winter country. People slept close not just for comfort but efficiency. Heat pooled where bodies gathered. Isolation, even inside a cabin, was discouraged. Outside, the forest resumes its low murmur. Wind threads through branches. Snow slips from a limb and lands with a muted thump. No howls follow immediately. The absence feels heavier than the sound did. Silence invites imagination more aggressively than noise ever could. You focus on physical sensations to ground yourself. The rough weave of wool against your cheek, the steady rise and fall of your chest, the faint warmth radiating from the hearth, uneven but persistent. These are real. These exist now. Your mind drifts briefly to the idea of wolves as villains, a reputation cemented in later stories and children's tales. That image does not match what you know here. Wolves are not plotting. They are navigating hunger territory weather. Their lives are shaped by necessity, not malice. Understanding that does not erase fear, but it softens it around the edges. Another subtle sound reaches you, barely more than a suggestion. It could be a paw pressing snow. It could be wind shifting a branch. The ambiguity is complete. You do not tense this time. You let the sound pass through awareness without attaching a story to it. That is progress, even if it does not feel dramatic. Fatigue presses heavier now, settling into muscles that have been alert for too long. This is how sleep arrives in places like this, not as surrender, but as compromise. You remain partly aware, partly adrift, a state somewhere between listening and dreaming. You think briefly of morning not as a certainty, but as a direction. Light will return eventually. It always does. Wolves will retreat deeper into shadow. The forest will look ordinary again, stripped of its nighttime intensity. Remembering that helps. Perspective widens fear until it becomes manageable. For now, you stay where you are, wrapped in thin layers, and shared silence, the cabin breathing around you. Wolves remain, outside voices fading into distance or memory. You do not need them to disappear entirely. You only need them to stay what they are, distant, separate, part of the night but not the center of it. Sleep deepens, slow and uneven but real. The mind loosens its grip on the dark, trusting the fragile structure around you just enough. And that in this moment is sufficient. Your sleep does not deepen so much as it rearranges itself. You are no longer fully awake, but you are not gone either. Awareness floats just beneath the surface, alert enough to catch changes, soft enough to let time blur. This is the kind of rest people learned on the frontier, a half-sleep tuned to the world outside the walls. Another howl arrives, but it is different from the earlier ones, shorter, broken into two parts. It rises, drops, then lifts again, as if the animal is checking its own position against the landscape. You feel the sound more than you hear it, a faint pressure in the chest, a reminder that distance is not the same as absence. People living in wolf country learned patterns without naming them. They knew that long, sustained howls often meant location calls, while shorter, choppier ones could signal regrouping. This was practical knowledge passed quietly, absorbed through repetition rather than instruction. You were never taught this directly, but lying here, you sense it anyway. The night has its own grammar. You shift your weight slightly and feel the earth beneath the bedding, unyielding and cold. Your body instinctively curls tighter, reducing exposed surface, conserving warmth. These movements are small and deliberate. Every frontier sleeper learned that restlessness burned heat, and heat was never free. There is a curious historical note tucked into letters and journals from the 1800s. Many settlers wrote that wolves seemed louder when they were tired. Not closer, louder. Exhaustion sharpened perception, in strange ways amplifying certain sounds while dulling others. The howl did not change, the listener did. You wonder now how much of what you hear is sound and how much is fatigue interpreting silence. Outside, the forest continues its quiet labour. Snow settles, ice forms. Somewhere a branch snaps under weight. The sound echoes briefly, then dissolves. You imagine the wolves pausing at that noise, ears turning, bodies still. They are listening too. Everyone is listening tonight. The fire shifts, sending a soft cascade of embers inward. Light pulses against the walls and then steadies. You count breaths until your heart slows again. Counting is grounding. It keeps the mind from wandering too far ahead. There was once a widespread belief that wolves howled to frighten humans on purpose. That idea lingered long after people stopped believing in most other animal superstitions. It framed the night as hostile intentional. Modern understanding paints a different picture. Howling maintains social bonds, coordinates movement, and advertises presence to other packs. Fear in this case is a side effect, not the goal. Still, not everyone agrees on how neutral those intentions always were. Some historians propose that wolves, pressured by shrinking habitats and dwindling prey, grew bolder near human settlements during certain periods. Others counter that such behaviour was localised and temporary, not a general pattern. The discussion remains unresolved, shaped by incomplete records and regional differences. From your place on the floor, theories feel distant. What matters is how it feels now. The howl fades again, and this time it is followed by a stretch of quiet, long enough to notice. Silence presses inward, filling the space left behind. You realise you have been bracing for sound, and its absence leaves you briefly unbalanced. You listen for breathing nearby. You find it. Slow, even. Another presence sharing the same uncertainty. That steadiness anchors you more than any wall could. Humans are built to take cues from one another, especially in the dark. A faint smell drifts through the cabin, sharp and animal carried on cold air. It could be from livestock tied close by. It could be something else. Frontier cabins often doubled as storage for hides, tools, and supplies that carried lingering scents. Wolves had noses far keener than yours, and scent travelled farther than sound. Knowing that does not bring panic. It brings resignation. The night is porous. It always was. An unusual practice from the period crosses your mind. Some families scattered ashes or crushed herbs around their cabins, believing certain smells discouraged predators. Sage, pine resin, even garlic found their way into winter routines. Whether these measures had any effect on wolves is unclear, but they offered a sense of agency. Action, even symbolic, eased the mind. You consider the thinness of belief and how often it supports survival. It is not truth that matters most in moments like this, but usefulness. Does it help you lie still? Does it slow your breathing? Does it let rest happen? The cold deepens gradually. It does not announce itself. It seeps. You adjust the blanket again, careful to trap warm air near your chest. The simple physics of survival plays out quietly. Insulation, conduction, stillness. No one uses those words here, but everyone understands them. Another sound reaches you softer than a howl, more intimate, a low whine or huff, distant enough to be ambiguous. You do not chase it with your thoughts. You let it exist and then pass. This is a skill learned slowly. Fear thrives on pursuit. Calm grows when you allow sensations to come and go without judgment. Your eyelids lower fully now. Images drift behind them. Not dreams yet, but impressions. Dark trees, pale snow, a sense of movement without direction. The wolves slip into this space too, no longer external threats, but shapes in the mind softened by distance and fatigue. You remember a simple, grounded truth that frontier families relied on, even if they never articulated it clearly. Most nights ended quietly. Most fears dissolved by morning light. The nights that did not were remembered precisely because they were rare. That perspective settles into you like an extra layer of cloth. Not thick, not foolproof, but helpful. Sleep finally gathers enough weight to pull you under. Sounds dull. Sensations blur. The cabin recedes into background presence. Wolves continue their lives beyond the walls, but they no longer occupy the center of your awareness. You drift suspended between vigilance and rest, knowing the night still holds unknowns, but trusting that this fragile balance has carried many others through before you, And for now, it carries you too. The fire becomes the quiet center of everything. Even when your eyes are closed, you sense it, a low pulse of warmth and light that anchors the room. It does not roar anymore. It murmurs, the kind of sound that suggests endurance rather than strength. This is the hour when fires are trusted, not watched. You shift your attention inward and notice how your body has arranged itself around that heat. One shoulder angled closer, feet tucked in tight, chin lowered to protect the throat. These are not conscious choices. They are habits shaped by cold nights and repetition. The body remembers what keeps it alive, even when the mind drifts. People on the frontier understood fire as more than warmth. It was boundary. Predators avoided flame instinctively. Light disrupted the night in ways animals did not like. Smoke carried human presence outward, announcing complexity and risk. This understanding did not require theory. It came from observation. Fires that burned steady through the night were associated with quiet mornings. Yet fire was never a guarantee. Embers could fail, sparks could die. Someone always slept light enough to wake if the glow dimmed too much. That responsibility rotated, shared without ceremony. It was simply known. You feel reassured by the fire's presence now, even though it barely reaches the far wall. Shadows still dominate the corners. Darkness presses inward, everywhere. The light does not touch. Comfort exists here, but it is selective. You accept that. A small sound pulls your awareness outward again. Not a howl, not movement, just the wind pressing more firmly against one side of the cabin, testing the logs, the way water tests stone. The structure answers with a long creak, deep and slow. You feel it through your back. The cabin holds. There is a practical, historical reality woven into moments like this. Many cabins were intentionally built with slightly uneven logs and flexible joints. Rigid structures cracked under pressure, flexible ones complained but survived. That design choice, born of necessity rather than engineering theory, allowed cabins to shift with weather instead of breaking. The noise was the price of resilience. You listened to the wind for a while, letting it replace the wolves in your attention. Wind feels less intentional, less alive. It does not watch, it does not choose. It simply moves. That makes it easier to tolerate. Still, your mind drifts back to the forest beyond the light. Wolves remain there, even if they are quiet now. You imagine them lying down somewhere in the snowtails, curled around bodies, conserving energy, the same way you are. The parallel surprises you. Survival looks similar across species when conditions are harsh. An unusual frontier custom surfaces in your thoughts. Some families kept a piece of iron near the hearth at night, believing it discouraged wild animals. Horseshoes, old tools, scraps of metal heated slightly by the fire. Whether wolves noticed or cared is uncertain, but iron carried symbolic weight. It represented industry, permanence, human intention. Symbols matter when reality feels thin. There has long been discussion among historians about whether firelight itself truly deterred wolves, or whether the associated smells and sounds mattered more. Some argue that flame was less important than the unpredictable noise of humans shifting and breathing. Others suggest that smoke carried signals animals instinctively avoided. The evidence remains scattered. What is clear is that people trusted fire enough to build their nights around it. You breathe in and catch the familiar scent again. Charred wood, ash, a hint of resin. The smell feels grounding. It belongs to this place. It tells you where you are. The fire pops softly, sending a tiny spark upward that vanishes before reaching anything else. Your body responds with a brief tension that fades quickly. Startle responses soften when nothing follows them. The nervous system learns slowly that not every sound requires action. Your thoughts grow less linear now. They drift, circle, repeat. Fatigue does that. It loosens the grip of analysis and lets impressions take over. The wolves recede into background awareness, no longer sharp enough to dominate. Another subtle sound reaches you, faint and rhythmic. Not outside, inside, someone breathing deeply nearby. That steady cadence becomes your reference point. As long as that rhythm continues, the world feels manageable. There is a quiet irony in how fear and comfort coexist here. The same thin walls that let sound travel also let warmth circulate. The same openness that makes you vulnerable keeps you alive. Frontier life was full of such contradictions. Protection was rarely absolute. It was negotiated night by night. You adjust the blanket again, careful to move slowly. The fire answers with a slight flare, then settles. You feel the warmth brush your face and then withdraw. It is never constant. It ebbs and flows like breath. Another belief from the time drifts through your mind. Some people claim that wolves respected fire so deeply that they would not cross a line of ash drawn around a shelter. Others dismissed this entirely, calling it wishful thinking. Whether the practice had any effect is uncertain, but the act of drawing that line mattered. It marked intention. It told the mind where safety was supposed to begin. You imagine that line now faint and imperfect circling the cabin. Not as a barrier, but as a reminder. You have done what you can. The rest belongs to the night. The wind eases slightly. The cabin relaxes, releasing a long, slow sound as pressure shifts. You feel it and then let it go. Your muscles follow, loosening fraction by fraction. Sleep approaches again, heavier this time, less fragile. Your awareness sinks deeper, carried by warmth and exhaustion. The wolves remain part of the environment, but they no longer command center stage. They exist alongside wind, fire, wood, breath. You do not know what the rest of the night will bring. You do not need to. This moment is enough. The fire holds. The cabin stands. Your body rests. And somewhere beyond the reach of light, the forest continues its quiet work, indifferent to your fears, but also uninterested in crossing the fragile boundary you have built from flame wood and shared presence. You are no longer trying to sleep, not actively. Sleep has become something that might happen later, something you allow rather than pursue. For now, listening feels more important. Listening is a form of watchfulness that does not require movement, and movement is expensive. Your ears adjust the way eyes do in darkness. At first, everything blends together, but slowly layers separate. Wind becomes distinct from wood. Fire separates from breath. The forest develops depth. You can tell when a sound belongs close to the cabin and when it belongs farther out, even if you cannot explain how you know. Experience sharpens senses quietly. People who lived on the frontier often described this kind of listening as exhausting but necessary. At night, hearing replaced sight. It carried warnings. It carried reassurance. The absence of sound could be as meaningful as its presence. This was not fear-driven alertness alone. It was adaptation. A faint rustle passes through the trees. It does not repeat. You do not tense this time. One sound without follow-up rarely means anything. Animals move constantly at night. Snow shifts under its own weight. Branches release what they have been holding. The forest is busy, even when it seems still. Your breathing remains slow and shallow, conserving warmth. You keep your mouth closed, exhaling through your nose to reduce visible vapor and sound. These habits formed without instruction, shaped by nights exactly like this one. The body learns efficiency quickly when cold enforces the lesson. There is a well-established reality that many frontier settlers slept lightly by necessity. Deep, uninterrupted sleep was rare during winter months. Fires needed tending. Weather shifted suddenly. Animals moved unpredictably. People learned to rest in layers, waking and settling repeatedly without fully emerging into consciousness. What you are experiencing now is not failure, it is normal. Another sound drifts in low and brief. It could be a distant paw pressing snow. It could be wind passing through a narrow stand of trees. You hold it in awareness without labeling it. Labeling invites stories. Stories invite fear. Your mind wanders briefly to the idea of wolves watching. It is a persistent image difficult to shake. Eyes reflecting light. Bodies just beyond the clearing. Yet when you examine it closely, you realize how much of that image comes from later storytelling, rather than lived experience. Wolves rely more on scent and sound than vision, especially at night. Watching is less important than sensing. Still, the feeling remains. Being observed is one of the oldest human fears. It does not require proof, An unusual anecdote from the period surfaces in your thoughts. Some settlers claimed they could tell when wolves were nearby the behavior of smaller animals. Chickens grew restless, dogs stiffened, even insects seemed quieter. Whether this sensitivity was real or imagined remains uncertain, but people trusted it enough to listen for secondary signs rather than waiting for the wolves themselves. You listen now for anything inside the cabin that suggests alarm. Livestock tied nearby remain quiet. No sudden movement, no panicked sound. That steadiness matters. Animals react faster than people, and their calm is contagious. The fire shifts again, settling deeper into embers. Light dims slightly. You consider whether to stir it, then decide against it. The glow remains sufficient, and movement risks smoke. Smoke irritates lungs and draws coughing. Coughing announces vulnerability. Tonight, restraint feels wiser. There has been ongoing discussion among scholars about how much of frontier night vigilance was practical and how much was psychological. Some argue that settlers overstated danger as a way to make sense of isolation. Others suggest constant low-level threats genuinely shape sleep patterns and stress responses. The truth likely sits somewhere between those positions, layered with regional differences and individual temperament. From inside the cabin, the distinction feels less important than the habit itself. You listen because listening feels necessary. A long stretch of quiet follows. Not empty quiet, but even quiet, balanced. The forest seems to exhale. You realize how tense your shoulders have been and let them drop slightly. The change is subtle but noticeable. Comfort returns in increments. Your thoughts grow slower. Instead of scanning for threats, you begin to notice rhythms. The fire pulses. Breathing rises and falls. Wind ebbs and returns. These patterns repeat without escalation. Repetition is calming. It tells the nervous system that nothing new is happening. You catch yourself drifting and pull back gently, not wanting to surrender fully just yet. This in-between state feels safer. Control without effort, awareness without panic. Another frontier belief floats up, one that never fully disappeared. Some people thought wolves avoided steady human routines. Irregular behavior confused them. Consistency signaled stability. Whether or not wolves noticed routines anchored people. Doing the same things every night reduced uncertainty. You are following one now, even if you do not realize it. Your body grows heavier against the bedding. Muscles relax further. Listening becomes less sharp, more ambient. Sounds blend again, not because they have changed, but because your need to separate them has eased. Outside, whatever movement existed has shifted elsewhere. The night is large, your cabin is small. That imbalance works in your favor. You are one quiet point among many, not a focal point. Sleep edges closer, no longer tentative. You allow your eyes to remain closed longer between moments of awareness. Each return to wakefulness feels less urgent, less necessary. You do not stop listening entirely. You never will tonight. But listening softens, turning from vigilance into background awareness. A gentle hum rather than a sharp edge. The wolves remain part of the world beyond the walls, but they no longer dominate your attention. They have become one sound among many, one possibility among countless others. That shift feels like relief. You sink deeper into rest, not because the night has become safe, but because you have learned how to exist within its uncertainty. And that skill, learned slowly and imperfectly, carries you forward into the dark with more ease than fear ever could. At some point in the night, your attention shifts from the forest itself to what stands between you and it. The animals tied nearby. Their presence has been a comfort and a concern in equal measure. You can smell them faintly now, a warm living scent that cuts through smoke and cold. It reminds you that you are not the only breathing creature sheltering here. Frontier families often kept livestock close during winter nights. This was not sentimentality, it was strategy. Animals represented food, labor, and survival. Losing one could mean hunger later. Keeping them near offered protection from weather, and theft, and their body heat added a subtle warmth to the space. That practice was widely known and quietly accepted even when it brought complications. You listen for any sign of distress from them. A sudden stamp, a sharp breath, a nervous shift. None comes. Their stillness eases you more than any wall could. Animals sense danger differently than people do, and their calm suggests that whatever passes through the forest tonight does not intend to come closer. Still, you are aware of the paradox. Livestock also attract attention. Their scent carries, their sounds travel. Wolves notice these things. Settlers understood this tension well. Protection and risk lived side by side, inseparable. You adjust your position slightly to ease a numb spot forming along your hip. The floor remains unforgiving. Packed earth does not soften with familiarity. It draws heat relentlessly, reminding you that comfort here is always temporary. You pull the blanket tighter and tuck your knees in, becoming smaller, denser. A sound outside catches your attention again. Not a howl this time, something lower. A brief series of sniffs or huffs so faint you almost dismiss them. Almost. You hold still, listening for repetition. Nothing follows. The night absorbs the sound and moves on. There is a long-held belief among some historians that wolves were far more interested in livestock than in people. This view suggests that most wolf activity near cabins centered on animals rather than human occupants. Other researchers caution against oversimplifying that relationship, noting that behavior varied by season, region, and circumstance. The truth, as with many things, resists a single explanation. What remains consistent is the uncertainty settlers lived with nightly. You imagine the wolves moving through the clearing's edge, noses low, gathering information rather than making decisions. Wolves rely heavily on scent mapping their world through invisible trails that linger long after bodies pass. You picture those trails, crossing and fading, overlapping with human paths, animal paths, weather. The night is layered in ways you cannot see. A curious detail from frontier accounts surfaces in your thoughts. Some families believed that tethered animals calmed wolves by signaling strength in numbers. A group that could afford to keep animals alive through winter suggested organization and defense. Whether wolves interpreted it that way is debatable, but the belief influenced how people arranged their nights. Confidence, even symbolic, mattered. You listen again to the animal's breathing, slow, regular, untroubled. That rhythm blends with the human breathing nearby, creating a shared cadence. It is grounding, almost hypnotic. The fire shifts lower, and the cabin darkens slightly. You resist the urge to stir the embers. Too much movement risks smoke and coughing. Coughing draws attention. Tonight, invisibility feels safer than comfort. Outside, the forest remains active, but not focused. Sounds come and go without pattern. A distant branch cracks. Snow slips. Wind brushes past and then retreats. You begin to recognize that this constant background noise is not threat. It is simply life continuing without reference to you. There has been debate among scholars about how often wolves actually approached livestock kept near human shelters. Some argue that wolves learned to associate cabins with danger and avoided them entirely. Others point to evidence of opportunistic behavior during especially harsh winters. Records suggest both happened depending on conditions. From inside the cabin, those nuances blur into a single question. Will anything change tonight? Your body answers first. Fatigue weighs heavier now, pressing your thoughts into simpler shapes. You are less interested in explanation, more interested in rest. That shift itself is protective. Fear loses power when it no longer has energy to feed on. You remember a small, almost amusing practice described in old letters? Some settlers spoke softly to their animals at night, not to calm them, but to remind themselves that the space was still human. Words, even whispered, reinforced presence. You consider doing the same, then decide against it. Silence feels right. Presence does not require sound. Another faint noise brushes the edge of your awareness. This one comes from inside. Someone adjusts a blanket, fabric whispers, then stillness returns. The simplicity of that sound reassures you more than any absence outside. You notice how your thoughts no longer jump immediately to worst-case scenarios. The wolves are still possible, so are many other things. but possibility has softened into background noise. The night has not become safer, you have become more accustomed to it. A broader historical observation emerges here, one rarely stated plainly. Living close to danger changes how fear functions. It becomes quieter, less dramatic, more integrated. Frontier life did not eliminate fear, it normalized it. That normalization allowed people to sleep at all. You let your eyes stay closed longer now. Awareness dips and rises like breath. When you surface, the scene is unchanged. No escalation. No new sound demanding interpretation. Stability settles in. The animals remain calm. The fire holds its glow. The cabin stands firm. The forest continues its distant movement without converging on you. These facts accumulate quietly, building confidence without fanfare. You drift again deeper this time. Images blur. Wolves become abstract shapes, then dissolve entirely. Sensations soften. The cold remains, but it is no longer sharp. It is simply present, like the weight of a blanket. You do not fully surrender to sleep yet, but you come close. Close enough that listening becomes passive rather than active. Close enough that fear loses its edge. In this fragile balance you find rest. Not because the world outside has changed, but because your place within it feels momentarily secure. And for a frontier night, that is as close to peace as one can reasonably expect. Sometime after the middle of the night, your thoughts begin to drift backward rather than outward. Instead of scanning the dark for what might happen next, your mind turns inward, pulling up fragments of stories you have heard all your life. Old warnings, half-remembered tales. The kind passed quietly, usually in winter, when people sat close to firelight and spoke just loudly enough to be heard. Wolves live comfortably in those stories. They always have. You remember how elders described them, not with precise detail, but with tone. Voices lowered slightly. Pauses stretched, just a bit longer than usual. Wolves were rarely the main subject. They were the shadow behind the subject. The reason for rules about fire, the explanation for why doors stayed barred even when nothing had ever tried to open them. In frontier communities, storytelling served a practical purpose. It carried information. When written records were scarce, it shaped behavior. Children learned when to stay close, when to listen, when not to wander. These narratives were not meant to terrify for entertainment. They were meant to teach caution through memory. A well-established observation from the period is that many wolf stories were told second-hand. Someone knew someone. A traveller passed through. A neighbour heard something once. Direct encounters were less common than retellings, yet the emotional weight remained. Fear travelled faster than facts, especially in isolated places. Lying here, you can feel how those stories settle into the body. They surface when the light is low and the mind is tired. They fill gaps that silence leaves behind. You are aware even now that some of what you feel belongs not to this night, but to many nights layered together across generations. You listen again for sound, half expecting the forest to answer your thoughts. It does not. The quiet continues deep and unbroken. That absence gives the stories more room than they deserve. One particularly strange belief slips into your awareness. Some settlers claimed wolves could sense fear itself, that nervous energy travelled outward like scent. The idea encouraged people to remain calm, to move deliberately to avoid frantic behaviour. Whether wolves sensed anything of the sort is doubtful, but the belief shaped how people managed themselves. Calm became a form of defence, you focus on your breathing, again, slow and steady, more for yourself than for any imagined observer. Each breath feels warmer than the last evidence that your body has settled into conservation mode. That physical shift reassures you more than any story ever could. The fire emits a soft crack, then settles. A single ember collapses inward. Light dims slightly, but not enough to matter. The cabin remains intact. The walls do not tremble. Nothing presses against them. There has been ongoing disagreement among historians about how much frontier folklore exaggerated the threat posed by wolves. Some suggest that stories grew darker over time, shaped by fear, isolation, and the need for meaning. Others argue that folklore preserved truths official records ignored. Sparse documentation does not equal absence of danger. The debate remains unresolved and perhaps always will. From your position on the floor, the distinction between exaggeration and truth feels academic. What matters is how the stories make you feel now. They sharpen your listening. They lengthen your pauses. They keep you alert just enough. You shift your head slightly, adjusting to a more comfortable position. The movement sends a faint rustle through the bedding. No one stirs in response. That silence is reassuring. It suggests shared trust in the moment. Another faint sound passes through the forest, distant and brief. Not a howl, more like a low murmur, easily swallowed by the night. You notice it without reacting. That change in yourself feels significant. Earlier, every sound demanded attention. Now some are allowed to pass. An interesting note from frontier journals comes to mind. Several writers mentioned that fear itself became tiring. Not the sharp fear of immediate danger, but the prolonged awareness of potential threats. Over time, people learned to live alongside it, the way one lives alongside cold or hunger. It became part of the background rather than the focus. You feel that transition happening now. Fear is still present, but it no longer occupies the center of your awareness. It has moved to the edges where it belongs. Your thoughts slow again. Instead of replaying stories, you begin to recall ordinary moments. Daylight tasks, familiar routines, the way the cabin looks in morning light, stripped of its nighttime weight. These images soften the present moment, stretching time forward rather than compressing it. Another belief surfaces, one almost gentle in comparison to the others. Some families said wolves howled to mark the passing of night, to measure darkness, the way people measured time by candle length. It was a poetic idea rather than a practical one, but it gave meaning to sound. Meaning reduces fear. You imagine the wolves now not as threats, but as participants in the same night, navigating cold and hunger and fatigue just as you are. That shared vulnerability creates an unexpected sense of balance. The forest is not hostile, it is indifferent, which is easier to accept. The cold deepens slightly, pressing against your back and legs. You respond automatically, tucking in tighter, minimizing exposed space. The movement is smooth, practiced. Your body knows what to do without instruction. Another long stretch of quiet settles in, not tense, not expectant, simply present. The kind of quiet that suggests nothing is changing. You realize you have not heard a howl in some time. The absence no longer feels ominous. It feels like continuation. Wolves move. They do not linger indefinitely. The forest shifts its focus. Your eyelids remain closed now without effort. Awareness drifts, returns, drifts again. Each return feels less urgent, less necessary. Sleep gathers weight quietly, like snow accumulating without sound. The stories recede, fear softens. The cabin breathes, the fire holds, and you find yourself resting, not because the world has become safe, but because you have learned just for tonight how to share space with uncertainty without letting it keep you awake. You are aware of bodies around you now, in a different way. Not just as shapes in the dark, but as sources of warmth, rhythm, and reassurance. The cabin has settled into its nighttime arrangement, one shaped by habit rather than discussion. Children closer to the hearth, older bodies tucked inward, stronger backs turned slightly toward the colder edges of the room. This pattern did not come from kindness alone, it came from observation. Frontier families learned quickly who lost heat fastest and who could endure it longer. Infants chilled first, elders followed. Adults in their strongest years absorbed cold with fewer consequences, at least for a while. These arrangements were repeated night after night until they required no words. You feel the logic of it now, even if you are not the one deciding. Warmth pools where bodies cluster. Air trapped between blankets and skin grows denser, more protective. The fire's uneven heat stretches only so far, and human bodies complete the work it cannot finish. A broadly recognized reality of winter life in the 1800s is that sleep was communal far more often than private. Separate rooms were rare, personal space was a luxury few could afford. Privacy yielded to survival. Nights were shared because they had to be. You listen to the smallest sounds inside the cabin. A child sighs and shifts closer to warmth. Someone clears their throat softly, careful not to wake anyone else. These noises are intimate, almost tender. They remind you that fear is distributed here, not carried alone. The presence of others changes how you experience the wolves outside. Alone, a howl might feel like a direct challenge. In a group, it becomes background. Not irrelevant, but less personal. Shared fear dilutes intensity. It becomes manageable. There is a peculiar historical note worth lingering on. Some settlers believed that wolves were less likely to approach cabins where multiple generations lived together. The idea was that such cabins radiated complexity and constant movement, even at rest. Whether wolves noticed or not is uncertain, but the belief reinforced multi-generational households and communal sleeping during winter. Confidence was built collectively. Your breathing synchronizes again with the people nearby. It happens without intention. One slow inhale seems to cue another. A shared exhale follows. This rhythm settles your nervous system more effectively than any thought could. Outside, the forest continues its muted activity. You hear nothing specific, but you sense continuity. Wind shifts, snow settles. Somewhere far off, something moves and then does not. The absence of focused sound feels reassuring. The wolves have not vanished, you know that. They simply are not pressing closer. That distinction matters. Night danger on the frontier was often about proximity rather than presence. Wolves could exist without being a problem. Problems arose only when distance collapsed. There has long been discussion among scholars about whether communal sleeping reduced fear or simply redistributed it. Some argue that shared space created collective vigilance, ensuring someone would notice changes quickly. Others suggest it allowed individuals to rest more deeply, trusting others to remain aware. The truth likely includes both. You feel it now. You are not fully asleep, but you are less alone. A small, almost whimsical belief drifts through your thoughts. Some families claimed wolves respected human hierarchy, sensing the presence of elders and leaders within a group. The idea had no scientific basis, but it reflected a broader truth. Order calms people. Calm alters behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes. You notice how still everyone has become. The cabin breathes, as one organism now expanding and contracting gently. The fire's glow is lower but still present. Shadows dominate, but they no longer feel threatening. They are simply spaces without light. Your body grows heavier against the bedding. Muscles release in stages, not all at once. Shoulders soften. Jaw unclenches. Hands relax where they rest. These changes happen gradually, without fanfare. Another sound drifts in from outside, faint and distant. Not a howl, more like a soft call quickly swallowed by the forest. You register it without tension. That reaction feels new. Earlier, any sound demanded analysis. Now some are allowed to pass unexamined. You think briefly of how fear functions differently in groups. Alone, the mind spirals inward. With others nearby, it spreads outward, losing intensity as it disperses. Frontier families depended on this effect, even if they never described it that way. There is a simple, enduring truth embedded here. Wolves rarely attacked groups of humans. They avoided clusters, firelight, unpredictability. This was not folklore, it was pattern recognition. Over time, people learned that togetherness itself offered protection. Still, uncertainty remains. Wolves are intelligent, circumstances change, hunger sharpens behavior. You do not pretend the night is harmless. You simply acknowledge that this arrangement has worked many times before. Your thoughts slow again, slipping into gentler territory. You imagine morning light touching the walls. The way frost sparkles briefly before melting. The smell of smoke giving way to damp earth and daylight air. These images pull you forward, easing the weight of the present moment. Another quiet sound inside the cabin draws your attention. Someone adjusts a child's blanket, moving slowly, deliberately. The care in that movement is unmistakable. It reminds you that fear does not erase tenderness. It often sharpens it. The wolves remain outside, part of the environment rather than the focus. They have not disappeared, but they have been repositioned in your mind. They are one element among many, not the center of the night. Sleep deepens further now. Awareness thins. Sounds blur at the edges. You remain loosely attentive, but no longer vigilant. The difference is subtle but important. In this shared warmth, surrounded by breathing bodies and familiar walls, you find rest not because danger has vanished, but because connection has taken precedence. The night continues, but you are no longer meeting it alone. And that, for now, is enough to let sleep take hold. The night carries smells as clearly as it carries sound. Once you notice them, they are impossible to ignore. Smoke is the strongest clinging to everything, embedding itself in wool, hair, and skin. Beneath it lies the earthier scent of the cabin itself. Damp wood, clay, old ash, and layered through all of that something animal, warm and faintly sweet, the quiet presence of bodies sharing space. Your nose fills in details your eyes cannot. Smell tells you how full the room is, how alive. It reassures you that nothing has changed suddenly. No sharp, unfamiliar odour, no sudden rush of cold air carrying something new. Everything is as it was moments ago, and that continuity matters. Frontier cabins were dense with scent by modern standards. With limited ventilation and constant fire use, smells accumulated rather than dissipated. People grew accustomed to it. Odour became information rather than nuisance. Smoke meant warmth. Animal scent meant food, and labour survived another night. Even the sour note of damp clothing signalled preparedness. You had not frozen outside. You inhale slowly through your nose, careful not to draw attention to yourself. The air feels thicker here, heavy with moisture from breath and melting snow tracked in earlier. That moisture clings to the walls, to fabric, to hair. In deep winter, it could freeze along seams by morning, leaving thin white lines inside the cabin. People woke to frost where their own breathing had settled overnight. It was an accepted inconvenience. A faint scent reaches you now that is less comforting. Musky, wild. It could be nothing more than old hide or stored tools absorbing the forest smell, or it could be carried on a draught slipping through the chinking. You hold your breath for a moment, testing the air. The scent does not strengthen. It does not move. You release the breath slowly. There is long-standing discussion among researchers about how much scent influenced wolf behaviour around human shelters. Some argue wolves were deterred by the layered smells of human smoke and livestock combined. Others suggest those same scents could attract investigation during times of scarcity. Evidence supports both interpretations in different contexts. What remains clear is that smell was a powerful mediator between inside and outside. Your mind wanders briefly to the idea of wolves tracking scent trails across snow, reading the landscape through invisible lines. You imagine how strong the cabin must smell to them, a knot of overlapping signals. Human fire, animal. It is not a clean invitation. It is confusing. Complexity discourages approach. A curious frontier practice surfaces in your thoughts. Some families burned specific woods at night, believing the smoke discouraged predators. Pine, juniper, cedar, when it could be found. Whether these choices altered wolf behaviour is uncertain, but people noticed differences in how smoke felt and smelled. Certain scents were associated with calmer nights, even if that calm was psychological. You shift slightly, the movement releasing a faint puff of warm air trapped beneath the blanket. The smell of wool intensifies briefly, then settles. No one stirs in response. The shared space remains quiet and steady. Outside, the forest continues to exist without reference to your senses. Wolves move through a world mapped by scent rather than sight, just as you map the cabin by smell in the dark. That parallel brings an unexpected sense of balance. You are both navigating the same night in different ways. The fire releases another small crackle, sending a whisper of new smoke upward. Your throat tightens slightly, then relaxes. Smoke irritates, but it also reassures. It means the fire lives. It means the boundary holds. There has been thoughtful disagreement among historians about whether frontier people perceived wolves primarily through sound, sight, or smell. Diaries mention all three, but emphasis shifts depending on region and season. Winter nights like this one elevated sound and scent over sight. Darkness erased shape. Smell lingered. Sound travelled. perception adapted accordingly. Your breathing deepens again, slow and controlled. The scent of the cabin becomes familiar enough to fade into background awareness. What was once sharp becomes neutral. The nervous system relaxes when stimuli remain constant. You realize you have not heard the wolves for some time now. That absence registers first as curiosity, then as relief. Smell remains unchanged. No sudden shift, no fresh trace of movement carried inward. The forest has moved on or settled elsewhere. Another soft sound inside the cabin draws your attention. Fabric brushes wood. Someone adjusts position, perhaps unconsciously, seeking warmth. The movement releases a faint human scent into the air. Soap, sweat, familiarity. That smell anchors you more than you expect. It is unmistakably human. It belongs here. Your thoughts soften again, losing their sharp edges. Sensations blend rather than demand separation. Smell, sound, warmth and weight merge into a single experience of being held by the space around you. You no longer imagine wolves at the edge of the clearing. They have receded into abstraction, part of the larger wilderness rather than specific presences. The cabin asserts itself now, not as a fortress, but as a living boundary, shaped by breath and fire and shared survival. Sleep approaches more steadily this time. Awareness thins without resistance. Your mind no longer scans for meaning in every sensation. It allows the night to exist without commentary. The smell of smoke lingers as you drift, a constant reminder of warmth and continuity. It threads through your dreams, grounding them, keeping them gentle. The forest remains outside, alive but distant, and in this mingling of scent and shadow, warmth and quiet, you slip deeper into rest. Trusting that for this stretch of night, the fragile balance holds. You wake just enough to notice that the night has changed texture. Not louder, not quieter, different. The air feels denser, pressing slightly against your face as you breathe. Cold has settled more firmly now, no longer drifting, but claiming space. Winter does this in stages, advancing without announcement. Your body registers it first, fingers tucked deeper into sleeves, feet drawn closer together, a subtle tightening along your spine. These adjustments happen without thought, refined by nights like this one, repeating over years. It is worth remembering that winters in the 1800s were not softened by modern heating or insulation. Cold entered homes as naturally as light. It shaped sleep posture and habit. People did not fight it, they accommodated it. You are doing the same now, even half asleep. A distant sound slips into your awareness. It might be wind passing through a stand of trees. It might be something else. You do not immediately classify it. That restraint feels intentional now. Earlier, your mind leapt toward explanation. Now it allows ambiguity to exist without urgency. There is a quiet truth often overlooked in retellings of frontier life. Wolf encounters were common in awareness, but rare in outcome. People heard wolves far more often than they saw them. They lived with sound as a constant companion, learning which noises mattered and which did not. This distinction was learned slowly through repetition, rather than instruction. You listen again. The sound does not repeat. The forest remains layered and active, but unfocused. Nothing converges on the cabin. That matters. An odd historical note drifts into your mind. Some settlers claimed they could sense when wolves had left the area entirely, not through sound, but through a change in the night's atmosphere. The air felt emptier, the forest less tense. Whether this was real or imagined is impossible to prove, but the belief itself reveals how closely people paid attention to subtle shifts. You wonder now if that is what you are feeling. Not safety exactly, but diffusion. The sense that attention has moved elsewhere. The fire glows faintly, its light barely touching the walls now. Embers pulse slowly, like a heart at rest. Someone nearby shifts slightly, then stills. No one speaks. No one needs to. The cabin has settled into its deepest rhythm. There has been considerable debate among scholars about how accurately historical accounts represent wolf behavior near human dwellings. Some suggest later writers exaggerated the threat to heighten drama or justify eradication campaigns. Others argue that early settlers underreported encounters out of familiarity or resignation. The surviving records are incomplete, shaped by perspective and purpose. Lying here, you feel the weight of that uncertainty. It mirrors the night itself. Your thoughts drift to the wolves again, but the image has softened. You imagine them moving through snow, navigating by scent and memory, following routes worn into the landscape long before this cabin existed. They are not circling you. They are passing through a world that continues regardless of your presence. This realization brings a subtle shift in your chest. The tightness eases, not gone, but lighter. The forest is large. Your cabin is one small point within it. That scale works in your favor. A curious belief from the period surfaces briefly. Some families thought wolves avoided places where human routines were consistent. Predictability signaled stability. Unstable environments attracted curiosity. Whether wolves perceive such patterns is questionable, but the belief encouraged steady behavior. Fires tended at regular times. Doors barred in the same way. Nights entered with the same rituals. Consistency calmed the mind, if nothing else. You notice how routine has carried you here. The way bedding was laid, the way bodies arranged themselves, the way listening softened into rest. None of this was accidental. It was learned, refined, passed down. Outside, the forest remains quiet enough that you can hear your own breathing clearly. Each inhale feels colder than before, but each exhale carries warmth back toward you. That exchange feels balanced now, rather than strained. Another faint sound brushes your awareness. This one is higher, thinner. Wind threading through a narrow gap. You follow it briefly, then let it go. The habit of constant evaluation has loosened its grip. There has long been discussion about whether frontier fear of wolves was rooted more in cultural memory than lived experience. Wolves occupied a symbolic space far larger than their actual impact in many regions. Yet symbols have power. They shape behavior even when danger is distant. That power does not disappear simply because it is understood. Your eyelids remain closed now without effort. Awareness drifts in wider arcs. You are still listening, but it feels less like guarding and more like witnessing. The cabin breathes around you. Wood shifts softly. The earth beneath holds cold without malice. The fire persists quiet and reliable. These elements form a stable pattern that your body recognizes. You realize you have not startled in some time. That fact registers gently, without pride. It simply is. The nervous system has recalibrated, accepting the night as it is rather than resisting it. Sleep deepens again, pulling you farther from the edge of wakefulness. Sounds blur into texture, smells soften, sensations merge, wolves recede fully into background presence, no longer distinct enough to command thought. You rest now, not because certainty has arrived, but because uncertainty has lost its sharpness. The night remains complex, layered, alive, but it no longer presses inward. In this softened awareness, you drift, carried by routine, shared warmth, and the quiet understanding that most nights end the same way they begin, with breath, with stillness, with survival that feels ordinary rather than heroic. Sleep loosens its hold on you just enough for thoughts to surface again, slow and unhurried. They drift rather than arrive. One of them lingers longer than the others, shaped like a question that never quite forms words. How real is the danger you are feeling? How much of it belongs to this night, and how much has been carried here from elsewhere? People living on the frontier rarely separated fear into neat categories. They did not label some of it rational and some of it imagined. Fear was simply information, another signal to be weighed alongside weather, hunger, and fatigue. You sense that now, lying in the dark, listening without urgency. There is a commonly accepted observation among historians that confirmed wolf attacks on sleeping settlers were uncommon. Records that do exist tend to cluster around extreme conditions. Famine years, severe winters, isolated individuals travelling alone. The image of wolves routinely testing cabin walls does not match most surviving evidence, and yet fear persisted. This contradiction has never been fully resolved. Some researchers suggest that the rarity of attacks made each one loom larger in memory. Others propose that unrecorded incidents went undocumented because survival itself took priority over record keeping. Diaries were not written every night. Not everything frightening made it onto the page. The uncertainty remains suspended between absence and possibility. You turn slightly careful not to disturb anyone else. The movement releases a small pocket of warmth that quickly fades. The cold presses back in, steady and patient. Winter never rushes, it waits. Your mind wanders to the way fear behaves in the dark. Without sight, it fills gaps generously. Sound becomes shape. Silence becomes intention. This is not weakness. It is pattern seeking an ancient survival tool. The problem is not that the mind creates patterns. It is that, at night, it creates too many. You notice now how your fear has changed since earlier. It is less sharp, more diffuse. Instead of picturing teeth and movement, you sense distance and possibility. That shift matters. Fear has become abstract rather than immediate. The body responds differently to each. An odd but persistent idea from the 19th century floats through your awareness. Some people believed wolves respected boundaries they could not see, invisible lines drawn by habit, scent, and human presence. The belief lacked evidence, yet it shaped how people thought about safety. Boundaries did not have to be physical to feel real. You imagine those boundaries now woven from routine and familiarity rather than walls. The cabin exists not just as a structure, but as a pattern repeated every night. Fire tended, bedding arranged, breath shared. Wolves encountering this complexity often chose distance. There has been thoughtful disagreement among scholars about whether wolves truly learned to avoid human shelters or simply encountered them rarely enough that avoidance seemed intentional. The landscape was vast. Cabins were scattered. Wolves had little reason to linger near unpredictable spaces filled with smoke and sound. Avoidance may have been coincidence rather than strategy. Or it may have been learned behavior passed through generations of animals, just as fear was passed through generations of people. Your thoughts slow again as that question drifts without resolution. You no longer feel the need to answer it. Some things do not require closure to allow rest. Outside, the forest remains subdued. No howls return. No movement presses closer. The night feels stretched thin as if approaching its quietest hour. That liminal time before morning when everything seems to pause. Inside, the cabin holds its shape. The fire continues its slow pulse. Bodies remain still. The shared space feels heavier with sleep now, denser with warmth and breath. You realize you are no longer listening for wolves specifically. You're listening to the night as a whole. That broader awareness feels less threatening. It removes focus from any single possibility. Another subtle realization follows. Fear often grows when it is isolated, when it stands alone without context. Earlier, wolves filled the entire mental landscape. Now they are one element among many. Cold, wind, fire, breath, wood, time. Each shares space. There is a simple, but often overlooked truth here. People survived not because danger was absent, but because danger was contextualized. Wolves existed, so did fire, so did routine. Survival emerged from the balance rather than the elimination of threat. Your breathing deepens again, slipping into a slower rhythm that signals deeper rest. Muscles soften further. Jaw relaxes, hands loosen where they rest. These changes happen quietly, without instruction. You drift through half-formed images, snow reflecting faint light, trees standing still. The cabin seen from above, a small pocket of warmth in a wide, dark world. Wolves appear briefly at the edge of this image, then fade, not chased away, simply no longer relevant. The night continues. Time moves without urgency. You are carried along with it rather than resisting its flow. Fear remains possible, but it no longer demands attention. It has taken its place among other sensations, no more dominant than the cold or the smell of smoke. In this softened state, you rest more fully. Not because certainty has arrived, but because perspective has widened. The night has room for wolves and sleep at the same time. And as awareness thins further, you allow yourself to drift, trusting that this balance, imperfect and temporary, has carried many before you through the dark, and will carry you as well until morning finds its way back. The weather makes itself known without asking for attention. You feel it through the cabin long before you hear it clearly. a subtle tightening of the air, a change in how cold presses against your skin. Winter does not arrive all at once. It adjusts its grip, slowly testing. Snow begins again, somewhere beyond the walls. You cannot see it, but you know the sound. Not falling exactly, but settling. A soft hush layered over everything else, muting edges, smoothing sharpness. Snow has a way of changing the character of the night. It absorbs sound, flattens distance, makes the world feel both closer and farther at the same time. People who lived through many winters learned this instinctively. Snowstorms did not always announce themselves with drama. Often they arrived quietly, thickening the dark, reshaping how sound travelled. A howl that once echoed clearly could fade faster. A distant movement might seem closer than it was. Weather altered perception as much as landscape did. You notice now how the forest feels quieter, not because it has emptied, but because snow is softening it. Wind loses its sharpness. Branches sound muffled. Even your own breathing feels louder by comparison. The cabin seems more enclosed, wrapped rather than exposed. There is a practical truth woven into this moment. Wolves rely on sound to communicate over long distances, but snow and wind interfere with that. Howls become shorter. Packs draw closer together. Activity shifts inward. Winter weather reshapes animal behavior, just as it reshapes human nights. This is not speculation. It is pattern observed over centuries. Still, interpretation remains complicated. Some historians suggest harsh weather increased the likelihood of wolves approaching human areas, driven by hunger and constrained movement. Others argue that deep snow made wolves more cautious, conserving energy and avoiding unnecessary risks. The evidence supports both depending on region and conditions. From inside the cabin, those distinctions blur into a single awareness. Weather matters. You adjust the blanket again, responding to the cold that creeps in more insistently now. The floor feels harder, colder, as if the earth beneath has stiffened. You curl slightly tighter, creating a smaller pocket of warmth. This movement feels practiced, almost automatic. Outside, the snow continues its quiet work. You imagine it layering over tracks, erasing paths, softening the world into something less defined. That thought brings an unexpected comfort. Snow covers things. It hides as much as it reveals. A curious frontier observation comes to mind. Some settlers believed that wolves were easier to hear, but harder to locate during snowfall. The sound carried strangely, bending and scattering. People learned not to trust direction on snowy nights. A howl from the east might belong to the north. Distance became guesswork. This uncertainty fed anxiety, but it also discouraged hasty conclusions. You listen now, aware of that distortion. No howls return, no sharp sounds cut through the hush. The forest feels padded, subdued. Even fear seems quieter under snow. The fire responds subtly to the changing air, drawing a bit more strongly as cold deepens. Embers glow brighter for a moment, then settle. The light they cast feels warmer by contrast, more intimate. Shadows thicken beyond their reach, but they no longer feel invasive. They are simply areas the fire does not visit. There has been long-running discussion among scholars about whether winter storms offered settlers a sense of protection or increased vulnerability. Storms isolated cabins, limited movement, and cut off help. At the same time, they reduced animal activity and masked human presence. Safety and danger arrived together, inseparable. Perspective determined which one felt louder. Your thoughts drift toward that balance. Storms trap you, but they also wrap you. The forest becomes less accessible, less curious. Wolves, if they are nearby at all, are dealing with their own challenges now. Cold, energy, shelter. The night belongs to everyone equally. You notice how your body responds to this shift. Tension eases slightly. Not gone, but less sharp. Snow has a calming effect, even when it carries risk. It simplifies the soundscape. It narrows focus. Another small sound reaches you, faint and internal. Someone nearby exhales deeply, rolling into a deeper stage of sleep. That sound reassures you. It signals that vigilance has loosened elsewhere too. You are not alone in sensing the change. The cabin creaks softly, as temperature shifts again. Logs respond to cold with small movements, settling into new positions. The sound feels familiar now, almost comforting. It means the structure is adjusting rather than failing. You let your eyes remain closed without effort. Awareness drifts anchored loosely to sound and sensation. Snow continues outside unseen but felt reshaping the night without drama. Wolves remain part of the equation, but weather has taken center stage. The forest feels less alive in a threatening way, more subdued, more inward. Life slows under snow. You breathe deeply, drawing warmth inward, releasing tension outward. Each breath feels slower, heavier. Sleep deepens naturally, no longer tentative. The night is still uncertain. Winter always is. But for this moment, wrapped in snow, softened sound, and shared warmth, the balance tips gently toward rest. And you drift with it, letting the storm outside do what storms have always done. Quiet the world just enough to allow sleep to finally take hold. Even as sleep deepens, your mind returns to a familiar sensation. Not fear exactly, something subtler. The feeling of being noticed. It does not arrive with sound or movement. It arrives as awareness, a quiet alertness that refuses to fully shut off. This is the psychology of being hunted, or at least believing you might be. It does not require an actual pursuer. It only needs uncertainty. On the frontier, people lived with this sensation often enough that it became background rather than crisis. The body learned how to hold it without breaking. You feel it now as a gentle tension along your spine, a readiness that does not demand action. Your breathing remains slow, your heart does not race, and yet part of you stays oriented outward, tuned to change. Modern language might call this hypervigilance, but for people in the 1800s, it was simply awareness. Night demanded it. Predators were real, weather was real, illness was real. Letting the guard down completely was rarely an option. Instead, people learned to rest alongside alertness rather than in opposition to it. There is a widely accepted understanding among historians that frontier sleep differed fundamentally from modern sleep. It was lighter, more segmented, and often interrupted. This was not pathology. It was adaptation. Survival favored those who could drift and wake without panic. You notice how your thoughts move differently now. Earlier, they leapt forward imagining scenarios. Now they circle closer to the present moment. Sensations take priority over images. The weight of the blanket, the steady warmth near the hearth, the quiet rise and fall of breath nearby. That shift matters. The mind feels hunted when it projects too far ahead. It calms when it stays grounded. The idea of being watched has always been more unsettling than being chased. Wolves rarely charged into cabins. That was understood even then. What unsettled people was the thought of unseen eyes beyond the light, the sense of intelligence in the dark, the possibility of assessment. And yet there is no clear evidence that wolves stalked cabins the way stories suggest. Some researchers argue that wolves simply passed through human areas without much interest, their presence interpreted through fear rather than intent. Others suggest that wolves were curious but cautious, observing from a distance before moving on. The question remains open, shaped by incomplete records and the difficulty of separating perception from reality. You lie with that ambiguity now, letting it exist without resolution. The night does not demand answers, it only demands presence. Your body responds to this state with small adjustments. Muscles remain relaxed, but ready. Ears stay open without straining. Breathing stays slow but controlled. This balance feels familiar, as if learned long ago. Perhaps it was. There is an intriguing note found in several frontier journals. Writers described moments when fear seemed to sharpen clarity rather than overwhelm it. Colours felt richer by firelight. Sounds gained texture. Time slowed. These moments were not pleasant, but they were not paralyzing either. They represented the nervous system working as intended. You recognize that clarity now. The cabin feels vivid despite the darkness. You can picture the grain of the logs, the soot marks above the hearth, the small imperfections that make the space familiar. Awareness does not scatter, it focuses. A curious belief from the period drifts into your awareness. Some people thought wolves could sense intention. Not fear, but decisiveness. Hesitation invited attention. Calm certainty repelled it. The belief had no scientific grounding, yet it shaped behavior in subtle ways. People moved deliberately. They avoided frantic gestures. They trusted routines. Whether wolves perceived any of that is questionable, but the belief helped people regulate themselves, and regulation is powerful. You feel regulated now? The earlier edge has softened into something steadier. The night no longer feels like a threat circling you. It feels like an environment you're temporarily inhabiting. Outside, the snow continues to fall or settle, difficult to tell which. The forest feels inward, turned less expressive. No howls cut through the quiet. No movement draws your focus. The absence of sound no longer feels like anticipation. It feels like rest. The psychology of being hunted loses its grip when no evidence sustains it. Without reinforcement, the mind relaxes its stance. You notice that your awareness has widened again. Wolves are no longer the center of your mental landscape. They are one possibility among many, no more dominant than cold or weather or time. That rebalancing feels significant. Another scholarly discussion comes to mind, one about whether early settlers exaggerated fear of predators because danger felt omnipresent in unfamiliar landscapes. Some argue fear was amplified by isolation and lack of control. Others suggest fear was calibrated accurately to conditions that modern people rarely experience. The truth likely sits somewhere between those interpretations. From within the experience, fear feels neither exaggerated nor precise. It feels responsive. Your breathing deepens further. Each exhale releases a little more tension from your shoulders. Hands rest heavily now, no longer clenched. Jaw softens. These physical changes signal safety to the brain, even if the environment remains uncertain. You realize something quietly important. You no longer feel hunted, you feel aware. The difference is subtle, but profound. Awareness does not drain energy the way fear does. It coexists with rest. The cabin remains steady. Fire persists. Bodies nearby sleep more deeply now. Their stillness signals that the collective has decided this moment is stable enough for rest. You trust that signal. Outside, wolves continue their lives, shaped by hunger and weather and instinct. They are not plotting. They are not waiting. They are navigating their own version of the night. This realization dissolves the last sharp edge of tension. The forest does not revolve around you. That is comforting. Sleep returns more fully now, no longer tentative. Awareness fades into background hum. The mind loosens its grip on possibility and settles into sensation. You drift not because danger is gone, but because your nervous system has decided that this level of uncertainty is survivable. And that decision made quietly and without ceremony allows rest to finally deepen. The psychology of being hunted gives way to something older and calmer. The psychology of endurance, of coexistence, of sleeping lightly in a world that never fully sleeps. And with that understanding settling gently into place, you allow yourself to sink further into the night, carried by routine warmth and the quiet confidence that for now nothing demands your immediate attention. Sleep arrives now in pieces rather than as a single descent. You drift under surface briefly, then sink again. Each return to awareness feels softer than the last, as if the mind is practicing letting go without fully committing. This is not restless sleep. It is segmented rest, shaped by environment rather than intention. People in the 19th century often experienced nights like this, especially in winter. Continuous 8-hour sleep was not the norm in many rural settings. Instead, rest unfolded in layers with shallow sleep, broken by brief waking moments. These pauses were not always anxious. Sometimes they were simply moments of orientation, quick checks that the world remained unchanged. You sense one of those pauses now. Your eyes remain closed, but awareness lifts just enough to register sound and temperature. The cabin is quiet. The fire still breathes. The air feels colder than before, but not alarmingly so. Nothing has shifted enough to demand response. You let yourself drift again. A fragment of sound pulls you back, faint and indistinct. It might be wind brushing the eaves. It might be snow settling from a branch. You do not know, and you do not try to decide. Earlier in the night, uncertainty felt dangerous. Now it feels tolerable. The difference lies not in the sound, but in your reaction to it. There is a well-recognized historical observation that people sleeping in predator-rich environments developed the ability to wake without panic. Diaries describe moments of waking, listening, and returning to sleep almost immediately. This skill reduced exhaustion and preserved energy. Panic, after all, burned resources the body could not spare. You feel that skill working now, even if you have never named it before. Awareness rises. Nothing requires action. Awareness lowers again. Another image drifts through your mind, half dream, half memory. Snow lit faintly by moonlight, trees standing still. A sense of movement without urgency. Wolves appear briefly at the edge of this image, not as threats, but as part of the scene. They do not approach, they simply exist. The mind often integrates fear into dreams once it feels manageable. Instead of replaying danger, it places it at a distance. This allows rest to continue without suppression. You experience that integration now as a sign that the nervous system has shifted from alert to adaptive. There has been thoughtful discussion among scholars about whether fragmented sleep made frontier people more resilient or more fatigued. Some suggest it sharpened responsiveness and reduced the shock of waking suddenly. Others argue it accumulated exhaustion over long winters. Both interpretations hold truth. Adaptation often carries a cost. Survival does not guarantee comfort. You drift again deeper this time. Sensations blur. The weight of your body feels heavier, more settled. Muscles that held tension earlier finally release. Shoulders sink. Breath slows further. Another brief waking moment arrives. This one is triggered by cold. The floor draws warmth downward, and your body responds by curling slightly tighter. The movement is small, efficient. You do not open your eyes. You do not lift your head. The adjustment is complete before thought fully forms. Frontier families learned these movements through repetition. Waking fully to adjust bedding wasted heat. Efficient shifts preserved it. The body learned to solve problems while half asleep. You are doing that now. An unusual but charming detail from the period surfaces briefly. Some people believed that waking naturally during the night meant the body was checking its surroundings the way animals do. The belief reframed wakefulness as wisdom rather than failure. Whether true or not, it eased frustration. Acceptance often improves rest more than struggle. You feel that acceptance now. You are no longer trying to sleep, you are allowing it to happen in its own uneven way. Outside, the forest remains subdued. Snow has softened everything into quieter forms. If wolves move, they do so without sound sharp enough to reach you. Their presence, if it exists at all, remains abstract. There has been ongoing debate about how often wolves vocalize during heavy snowfall. Some researchers suggest they howled less to conserve energy and maintain proximity. Others argue that howling continued, but travelled shorter distances, making it seem absent. The distinction is difficult to prove. From inside the cabin, the result is the same. Silence deepens. You notice how silence feels different now than it did earlier. It no longer presses inward, it expands outward. It creates space rather than tension. Your breathing becomes slower still, almost imperceptible. Each inhale feels shallow but sufficient. Each exhale releases warmth into the small pocket you have created beneath the blankets. Another fragment of sleep carries you under. This one lasts longer. When you surface again, it takes a moment to remember where you are. That disorientation is gentle rather than alarming. It signals deeper rest. You register the cabin again. The fire remains. The bodies nearby are still. The world has not changed in your absence. That continuity reassures you more than any certainty ever could. You let yourself sink again. In this rhythm of drifting and returning, the night loses its sharp edges. Time stretches, then dissolves. Fear no longer has momentum. It cannot build without sustained attention, and your attention has softened. The wolves that once commanded your thoughts have become part of the dream landscape. No longer external threats, but distant symbols. They fade in and out without consequence. Fragment by fragment, rest accumulates. Not perfect, not uninterrupted, but real enough. And as another wave of sleep carries you under, deeper than before, you realize that this is how many nights were endured, not conquered. Endured quietly, piece by piece, until morning arrived not as triumph, but as continuation. You drift again, and this time you stay under longer, the cabin holding you in its steady, imperfect shelter as the night moves on without demand. You surface again from sleep with the distinct impression that something has changed. Not dramatically, not enough to startle you fully awake, just enough to register as different. The air feels tighter. The quiet has weight again. You do not move, you listen. At first, there is nothing specific, only the sense that the forest has leaned in slightly. The space beyond the walls feels nearer than it did before, as if distance has folded in on itself. This is the danger of night's perception. Closeness is not measured in feet, it is measured in attention. Then you hear it. Not a howl, not yet. A softer sound, snow compressing under weight. A pause, then another compression. Slow, deliberate, far enough away to be uncertain, close enough to matter. Your body responds before your thoughts do. Muscles tighten subtly, breathing shallows. You remain still, conserving heat and noise. Stillness has become instinct now, not fear-driven, but practiced. This is the moment people later describe as wolves coming closer, even when no one ever sees them. It is the feeling of proximity without confirmation, the sensation that the forest has shifted focus. Those who lived through many winters knew this feeling well. Wolves often moved quietly when investigating unfamiliar scents, especially around human shelters. They did not rush, they did not charge. They approached in measured ways, testing the air, gathering information, ready to retreat at the first sign of unpredictability. That understanding did not erase fear, but it shaped how people interpreted sound. You listen again. The sound does not repeat immediately. That absence stretches your nerves thin. You find yourself wanting another noise, something to clarify intent. Silence denies you that. An old account from the period comes to mind, one written by a settler who described nights when wolves seemed to orbit the cabin rather than approach it directly. He wrote of footsteps that appeared vanished, then reappeared elsewhere, as if the animals were mapping the structure without touching it. Whether this description reflects reality or perception is difficult to determine, but the sensation it conveys feels familiar now. Your heart rate remains controlled, slower than it would have been earlier in the night. That alone feels like progress. Fear has not vanished, but it no longer hijacks your body. You shift your awareness inward, briefly checking the fire. It still glows faint but steady. Enough light remains to break the darkness into shapes. Enough warmth persists to signal occupation. The boundary holds. Another sound reaches you, this one, unmistakable. A low, breathy huff. Brief, curious rather than aggressive. It drifts through the cracks in the wall and dissolves before you can locate its source. You do not need to imagine what made it. You already know. Wolves investigate with their noses first. Breath carries information. Warm air leaking from the cabin tells a story of bodies and fire and life. That information does not automatically invite approach. It invites assessment. There has long been disagreement among researchers about whether wolves actually came close to cabins as often as people believed. Some argue that such proximity was rare and memorable, precisely because it broke the usual pattern of avoidance. Others suggest that wolves approached more frequently than records indicate, their presence noticed, but not always documented. The truth remains blurred by time and selective memory. What matters now is not frequency, but experience. You remain still, letting the moment unfold without interference. Panic would waste heat and announce vulnerability. Movement would disrupt the fragile balance you have built with the night, so you do nothing. Inside the cabin, no one else stirs. Either the sound has not reached them, or they have chosen the same restraint you have. That shared stillness feels deliberate, as if learned collectively through repetition. Another soft sound follows farther away this time. Snow disturbed again, but retreating rather than approaching. The pattern matters. Wolves test, then decide. Decision often favors distance. You exhale slowly, careful not to release tension too quickly. Relief can be dangerous if it leads to careless movement. You hold still a moment longer, listening for confirmation. None comes. The forest seems to loosen again, attention drifting outward rather than inward. Whatever curiosity passed near the cabin appears to have moved on, drawn by other scents, other paths. Your body registers the shift gradually. Muscles release fraction by fraction. Breath deepens slightly. The sharpness at the base of your skull eases. You do not celebrate, you simply continue. A strange thought surfaces now, one noted in several frontier journals. People often wrote that the moments when wolves felt closest were also the moments when nothing happened. No attack, no escalation. Just proximity and then withdrawal. The tension itself became the event remembered more vividly than actual danger. That makes sense. The mind remembers uncertainty more clearly than outcome. You lie quietly, letting the afterimage of the moment fade. The night has reminded you of its capacity for sudden focus, but it has also demonstrated restraint. The balance remains intact. The fire settles further, embers collapsing inward. Light dims again. Shadows reclaim more of the cabin. You adjust your position slightly, a controlled movement that does not disturb air too much. The adjustment feels earned. Your thoughts slow once more, drifting back towards sleep. The wolves so vivid moments ago recede into abstraction again. They remain possible but no longer immediate. There has been thoughtful debate among historians about whether people in the past overinterpreted animal behavior due to constant vigilance. Some suggest heightened awareness amplified ordinary movements into perceived threats. Others argue that such interpretation was a rational response to living without buffers or backup. Both perspectives carry weight. From inside, the experience interpretation feels less important than response. Your response has been measured. That matters. You notice how quickly the body returns toward rest once tension passes. Muscles soften, breathing steadies, awareness widens. The nervous system is remarkably efficient when allowed to complete a stress cycle without interruption. Another long stretch of quiet settles in. Not empty, not tense, just present. Snow continues its slow work outside, covering traces, smoothing paths. The forest withdraws into itself. You feel sleep gathering again, heavier than before. The recent alertness has drained energy, but it has also clarified something important. You can meet moments like that without losing yourself to fear. You can return. As you drift, images blur. The sound of breath inside the cabin becomes more prominent than anything outside. The wolves fade back into the larger night, no longer distinct enough to command thought. The sense of closeness lingers briefly, as memory then dissolves. What remains is a deeper appreciation for the fragile competence that carried people through nights like this. Not bravery, not denial, just practiced restraint and patience. You sink again into sleep, this time more fully. The night continues unpredictable and alive, but for now, it has taken its focus elsewhere. And you, wrapped in wood and fire and shared stillness, allow rest to return, knowing that even closeness does not always lead to danger, and that endurance often looks exactly like this. When sleep loosens again, your awareness settles on the objects within reach. Not the walls, not the forest, the tools. They rest where they always do, leaned carefully against the wall, placed close enough to touch, without reaching far enough not to trip over in the dark. Their presence is quiet, unspoken, and deliberate. An axe handle catches a sliver of firelight, wood worn smooth by hands and years. The head is dark, its edge dulled slightly, from use not neglect but honesty. This is not a weapon in the heroic sense. It is a tool. It splits wood. It repairs what breaks. Tonight, it waits. People on the frontier kept tools near at night for practical reasons that had little to do with fighting. Fires failed, roofs shifted, animals needed calming. A sound in the dark might require light leverage or reassurance more than force. Tools were solutions before they were defenses. That perspective matters. It reshapes how fear behaves. When you see tools as answers rather than weapons, panic loses its drama. Problems become tasks. Tasks can be addressed. There is a grounded historical understanding that most settlers did not expect to fight wolves directly. That idea belongs more to later storytelling than lived reality. Wolves were fast, coordinated, and cautious. Chasing them with a single tool would have been foolish. The tools existed for contingencies, not confrontations. You notice how your hand rests naturally closer to the axe handle than it did earlier. Not gripping, not reaching, just aware. That awareness is calming in its own way. Preparedness reduces imagination's worst excesses. Another object sits nearby, less obvious but equally important. A long stick smoothed at one end from frequent use. It is for stirring embers, nudging logs, reaching without exposing skin to flame. Tonight, it also represents distance, the ability to affect something without getting too close. Frontier life favoured such extensions of reach. Poles, hooks, sticks, simple tools that allowed interaction with danger at a remove. This applied to fire animals, even other people. Distance was safety. A curious detail from the period drifts into your thoughts. Some families kept noisemakers near the door at night, empty tin cups, loose metal, objects that would rattle if disturbed. The goal was not to scare predators, but to wake people. Sound as early warning, awareness as defense. Whether wolves ever triggered such alarms intentionally is uncertain. What is clear is that people valued notice over confrontation. Being awake mattered more than being armed. You listen again to the night. Nothing presses closer. The tools remain untouched. Their stillness mirrors the forest's restraint. There has been long-standing discussion among historians about whether the presence of tools provided real security or simply psychological comfort. Some argue that tools were unlikely to change outcomes in rare worst-case scenarios. Others suggest that confidence itself altered behavior in ways that reduced risk. Calm responses discouraged escalation. The debate continues, shaped by sparse evidence and human interpretation. From where you lie, the distinction feels thin. Comfort that steadies the mind can be as valuable as strength. Your breathing remains slow and even. Earlier awareness of the wolves sharpened your senses. Now, awareness of preparedness softens them. Balance returns. Balance. The fire shifts again, embers settling deeper. The light dims but does not disappear. Tools fade back into shadow, present but unobtrusive. That feels right. They are not meant to dominate attention. They are meant to wait. Another thought surfaces, one rarely spoken aloud in those days. Tools also represented responsibility. If something went wrong, action would fall to someone. Being near the tools meant being ready to respond. Readiness carried weight. It was shared among adults without ceremony. You sense that weight now, even if you are not the one expected to rise. The knowledge that someone would if needed offers reassurance. Roles existed. Night had structure. Outside, the forest remains quiet. Snow continues to soften the world, muting edges. If wolves move, they do so without urgency. Their caution mirrors yours. You shift slightly, careful not to disturb air or light. The movement brings your fingers closer to the axe handle for a moment. The wood feels cool, solid, familiar. That tactile certainty grounds you more than sight ever could. You do not grasp it. You simply acknowledge it. Your hand withdraws again, returning to rest. The tool remains where it belongs, unused. A broader historical observation settles in. Survival on the frontier depended less on dramatic action and more on readiness that was rarely tested. Nights passed quietly, more often than not. Tools waited, fires burned, wolves remained outside. The uneventful nights did not make stories, but they made lives. You feel the truth of that now. The night has offered tension, proximity, uncertainty. It has not demanded action. That restraint is part of its pattern. Sleep edges closer again, heavier this time. Awareness of tools fades into background presence. The mind no longer needs to check them. Trust has been established. Your breathing deepens. Muscles relax further. The hand that brushed the axe handle earlier now rests loosely warm against the blanket. The body understands that this moment requires rest, not readiness. The forest remains beyond the walls, alive and indifferent. Wolves continue their movements, shaped by hunger and weather and instinct. They do not linger here. The tools remain still. As sleep gathers you again, you carry with you the quiet reassurance of preparedness. Not bravado, Not expectation of conflict, just the knowledge that if something changed, there were answers nearby. That knowledge allows the mind to let go. You drift under once more, carried by the steady breath of the cabin, the fading glow of the fire, and the simple comfort of having what you need within reach, even if you never have to use it. Sleep does not fully take you yet. Instead, your thoughts wander into quieter, stranger territory, the place where beliefs live, when proof is thin and nights are long. These are the ideas people rarely argued about openly, because arguing required daylight confidence. At night, beliefs were simply used. You remember hearing about charms and habits meant to keep wolves away. Not shouted warnings or bold defenses, but small, almost tender gestures. Things done without expectation, only hope. The kind of actions that make fear feel occupied. One widely known practice involved hanging scraps of fabric or old clothing near the door. The belief was that human scent, especially worn scent, confused predators or made them hesitate. Whether this worked in any practical sense is unclear, but it reflected a deep understanding of scent as communication. Humans left messages without words. Wolves read them without sound. You imagine those scraps now stiff with frost, moving slightly when the door opened earlier. Ordinary things made symbolic by necessity. A shirt became a boundary. A scarf became reassurance. Another odd custom involved spoken words. Some families whispered specific phrases before sleep, not prayers exactly, but acknowledgements. Statements of presence. We are here. We are many. We are awake enough. These phrases were not directed at wolves so much as at the night itself. Saying them out loud made the darkness feel less absolute. Frontier life produced many such habits, born not from superstition alone, but from the need to do something. Action, even symbolic, prevented the mind from spiraling. It gave fear a task and then sent it to rest. You notice how calm you feel recalling these things. They do not sound foolish from here. They sound practical. Comfort does not require certainty, it requires participation. There has long been disagreement among scholars about how seriously people believed in these customs. Some suggest they were half jokes passed along with a smile. Others argue they were held with quiet sincerity, especially during harsh winters when options were limited. The truth likely varied by family, by night, by how tired people were when darkness arrived. Your breathing remains slow and even as you think about this. The night feels less empty when filled with small rituals. The cabin becomes not just shelter, but a place layered with intention. A particularly curious belief surfaces now. Some settlers thought wolves avoided places where human names were spoken aloud at night. Naming was thought to assert identity, to anchor people in the space. The idea had deep roots in older traditions, brought across the ocean. Names carried power. Silence invited ambiguity. You consider that belief for a moment, then smile faintly in the dark. Whether or not wolves cared, people did. Saying names reminded them who was present, who mattered, who was being protected. Outside, the forest remains quiet, as if allowing these thoughts their space. No sound intrudes. The snow continues to soften everything into gentler forms. There is a broader historical reality beneath all these customs. Frontier life demanded psychological endurance as much as physical strength. Long nights' isolation and uncertainty wore people down slowly. Small beliefs acted as buffers, preventing exhaustion from turning into despair. They were not about controlling the world, they were about managing the self. You feel that management happening now. Fear exists, but it has been given boundaries. It no longer roams freely through your thoughts. It has been assigned a corner, a task, a limit. Another unusual practice comes to mind. Some families kept a candle unlit near the bedding, believing that the possibility of light mattered as much as light itself. The candle was not for burning unless needed, it was for knowing it was there. Potential comfort has its own weight. You glance mentally toward where such a candle might be. You do not see it, but you know where it would be if it existed. That knowledge is enough. There has been thoughtful debate among historians about whether such beliefs reduced fear or reinforced it by constantly acknowledging danger. Some argue that rituals kept anxiety alive by focusing attention on threat. Others suggest the opposite. Rituals contained fear, preventing it from spreading unchecked. Lying here, you feel the latter more strongly. Structure soothes. Your body responds to this quiet reassurance. Muscles soften again. Breath deepens. The cold remains, but it feels less intrusive. Sensations blend rather than compete. You realize that earlier in the night you were reacting to wolves as an unknown. Now they feel familiar. Not friendly, not harmless, but known. They have a place in your mental landscape shaped by stories, habits, and experience rather than raw fear. That familiarity reduces their power. Monsters thrive on anonymity. Known things are easier to coexist with. Another small belief surfaces almost playful. Some people claimed wolves disliked uneven ground near cabins, associating it with traps or instability. As a result, stones or branches were scattered deliberately near doorways. Whether wolves noticed or not, the act gave people something to arrange, something to control. Order imposed on chaos. You imagine that uneven ground now half buried under snow. It does not matter if it works. What matters is that someone cared enough to try. Your awareness drifts again toward the present moment. The cabin is still. The fire holds. No one moves. The forest remains distant. The rituals you have recalled do not need to be performed now. They have already done their work. You feel sleep gathering again, heavier than before. Thoughts slow. Beliefs blur into impressions. The mind no longer needs to rehearse protection. It trusts what has already been established. The night continues outside, indifferent but not hostile. Wolves exist within it, moving according to their own needs, not yours. That understanding feels stable. As you drift, you carry with you the quiet knowledge that survival has always been partly practical and partly imaginative. Tools and fire matter. So do stories and small gestures. Together they build enough safety to allow rest. You sink back into sleep, wrapped not just in blankets but in layers of meaning accumulated over many nights, like this one. And for now, that layered comfort is enough to let go again, even with the wilderness breathing just beyond the walls. The night has thinned in a way that is hard to describe but easy to feel. It is no longer pressing inward. It is stretching, easing, loosening its hold. You sense this without opening your eyes, the way you can sense a room emptying even before footsteps fade. This is the hour when endurance quietly turns into habit. Fear does not disappear, but it loses its urgency. It becomes something you can smile at gently, the way you might smile at a child who has exhausted themselves with worry and finally grown quiet. A soft thought crosses your mind, unexpected and almost humorous. How strange it is that something as ordinary as routine can stand up to something as primal as fear. And yet that is exactly what has been happening all night. On the frontier, humour was not a luxury. It was a survival tool. Letters and recollections from the period often mention dry jokes shared at the worst moments. Not loud laughter, but understated remarks delivered without ceremony. Humour signalled control. It reminded people that they were still thinking, still choosing their responses. You imagine someone in the cabin earlier before sleep took hold, making a quiet comment about the wolves being better behaved than expected, or the fire lasting longer than usual. Nothing clever, just enough to soften the edge of tension. That kind of humour did not deny danger. It acknowledged it without giving it dominance. There is a broadly accepted understanding among historians that frontier communities relied heavily on emotional regulation, even if they never named it as such. Keeping fear manageable mattered as much as keeping food stored. Panic led to mistakes, calm allowed judgment. Humour acted as a pressure valve, releasing fear before it built to something destructive. You feel the effect of that release now, even if no joke was spoken aloud tonight. The idea of humour alone lightens the atmosphere inside the cabin. The night feels less personal, less confrontational. Your breathing has become slow and deep enough that you barely notice it. Each inhale arrives naturally. Each exhale leaves warmth behind. The cold remains, but it no longer feels aggressive. It feels like a condition rather than a threat. Outside, the forest remains quiet. Snow continues to soften, everything reshaping sound and movement into something less sharp. Wolves, if they are still nearby, have blended back into the larger landscape. Their presence is no longer distinct enough to occupy your thoughts. There has been ongoing discussion among scholars about whether fear of predators declined over time as settlers grew more familiar with their environment. Some argue that familiarity reduced anxiety and sharpened practical response. Others suggest that fear never truly faded but became normalized, woven into daily life. Both interpretations carry truth. What changes is not fear itself, but how much space it occupies. You sense that shift now. Wolves no longer fill the night. They occupy a corner of it, acknowledged but not central. The cabin, the fire, the shared warmth have reclaimed the foreground. Another faint sound reaches you this time from inside, a soft snort of breath, someone turning deeper into sleep. The sound carries a hint of comfort, almost amusement. It reminds you how close rest is now for everyone. You think briefly about how many nights like this were endured without being recorded. How many people lay exactly as you are now listening, waiting, calming themselves with small thoughts and routines. History often remembers crises and catastrophes. It rarely remembers the quiet competence of nights that passed without incident. Yet those nights were the foundation of survival. An unusual detail from the period surfaces, now one that speaks directly to this quiet competence. Some families kept track of uneventful nights, the way others kept track of storms. They marked them mentally, noting that nothing had happened again. Each uneventful night built confidence. Over time, fear lost its novelty. You feel that accumulation now, even though this is only one night. The absence of escalation has taught you something. The night can be endured. The forest can remain outside. Wolves can exist without crossing the boundary. That realization is not dramatic. It does not arrive with relief or triumph. It settles gently, like a blanket pulled a little higher. There has been thoughtful disagreement among researchers about whether this kind of calm acceptance reduced vigilance too much, making people careless. Some argue that normalizing danger dulls response. Others suggest the opposite. Acceptance frees mental resources, allowing quicker reaction when change truly occurs. From within the experience, acceptance feels like clarity rather than complacency. Your awareness remains intact. You are not numb, you are simply not overwhelmed. You notice how your thoughts no longer chase possibilities. They stay close to the present. The feel of fabric, the steady warmth near the hearth, the faint smell of smoke that has become so familiar it barely registers. This is the quiet triumph of the night. Not that danger has vanished, but that it has been placed in proportion. A small smile touches your thoughts again. Wolves howling once felt like a test you might fail. Now it feels like part of the night's soundtrack, no more defining than wind or snow. That shift feels earned. Outside, if any movement occurs, it does so without urgency. The forest has resumed its broader rhythms. Attention has moved on. Inside, the cabin feels heavier with sleep now, denser with warmth and breath. The structure seems to relax, along with the people inside it. Wood settles, the fire murmurs, everything aligns. You allow your awareness to soften further, trusting the pattern that has carried you here. You do not need to monitor every sound anymore. You have proven to yourself that you can respond if needed. There is a subtle pride in that realization, though it does not feel boastful. It feels quiet and private, a recognition of resilience rather than bravery. Sleep draws closer again, no longer fragile. It has weight now, momentum. When it takes you this time, it will carry you deeper. You let it happen. The wolves, once so vivid, have faded into the wider night. They exist, but they do not define this moment. The cabin, the fire, the shared presence define it now. As sleep settles over you again, you carry with you the understanding that endurance often looks like this. Calm without drama, humor without laughter, strength without display. And in that understanding, you finally rest more fully, letting the night continue its quiet work without needing your attention, trusting that for now, the balance holds. Your thoughts begin to lean toward morning, even though morning is still far away. It is not a conscious hope so much as a subtle orientation, like a compass needle, shifting without you touching it. The night has passed its most demanding hours. You can feel that in your bones, This is the quietest stretch, the time just before dawn, when the world seems to hold its breath. Fires burn lower, winds pause between movements, animals settle into stillness. It is not peace exactly, but it is suspension. People who live close to wilderness recognize this hour instinctively. They spoke of it as the long pause, the moment when danger felt least active, not because threats vanished, but because energy ran low. Predators rested, humans rested, the night itself seemed tired. You notice how different your body feels now compared to earlier. The sharp readiness has softened into a steady calm. Muscles no longer hover on edge, breath is slow and deep. Even the cold feels more distant, as if your body has accepted it as part of the background rather than something to resist. There is a well-established historical understanding that dawn was the safest psychological marker for frontier families even before light appeared. The idea of morning carried weight. It meant activity would resume, fire would be stirred, noise would return, the world would become visible again. That promise alone eased fear long before sunrise. You sense that promise now, faint but present. The darkness no longer feels endless. It feels like a stretch with a boundary. Outside, the forest remains still. If wolves move at all, they do so quietly, conserving energy. Their most active hours have passed. That shift in rhythm is subtle but real. Night predators do not maintain peak alertness indefinitely. Fatigue shapes behavior as surely as hunger does. There has been ongoing discussion among scholars about whether wolves altered their activity patterns in response to human presence or simply followed natural cycles regardless. Some argue wolves avoided dawn near settlements, preferring deeper forest during times of transition. Others suggest they moved freely indifferent to human schedules. The evidence varies, but many first-hand accounts describe fewer encounters near shelters as night waned. From inside the cabin, that pattern feels believable. The forest no longer presses inward. Attention has drifted elsewhere. You listen again, not with tension, but with curiosity. No howls return. No footfalls disturb the snow. The silence feels stable rather than charged. A small, almost comforting detail from frontier life surfaces in your mind. Many families timed their deepest rest for this hour, trusting that the most uncertain part of the night had passed. Children slept more soundly. Adults allowed themselves to sink a little deeper. It was not absolute safety, but it was relative. You feel yourself following that rhythm now. Sleep grows heavier. Awareness thins. When thoughts arise, they are gentle, unhurried. The fire glows faintly but steadily. Embers pulse like a sleeping animal, alive but not demanding attention. The warmth they give is uneven but sufficient. It has carried you this far. The cabin creaks softly as temperature shifts again. This time the sound does not startle you at all. It barely registers. Familiar noises have lost their power to disrupt. You notice how still everyone else is. Breathing remains slow and deep. No one stirs. The collective has settled into trust. There is something quietly profound about this moment. The night that once felt full of threat now feels simply long. Its intensity has drained away, leaving only duration. Endurance has done its work. Another scholarly debate comes to mind, one that feels distant now. Some historians suggest that fear of predators declined sharply after the first years of settlement. Others argue it remained constant, merely changing shape. Lying here, you suspect both are true. Fear fades in urgency, but not in presence. It becomes background knowledge rather than active alarm. You feel that transformation now. Wolves have become part of the landscape, in your mind no more central than trees or snow. They exist, you acknowledge them, then you let them be. Your breathing deepens again, signaling a shift into more complete rest. The body recognizes this hour as a safe place to let go a little more. Muscles relax further, hands rest heavy and warm beneath the blanket. The cold remains, but your body has adapted to it. Heat loss slows, the sensation dulls. What once felt sharp now feels distant. You drift into a longer stretch of sleep this time, not fragmentary, but continuous. Awareness recedes without resistance. The mind no longer needs to check in. If a sound occurs outside, it does not reach you. If movement happens, it does not register. The night continues, but it does not ask for your attention anymore. You're aware vaguely that morning will come, not soon, but inevitably. That knowledge rests quietly in the background, easing whatever remains of vigilance. In this deepest part of the night, wrapped in shared warmth and familiar stillness, you rest not because danger has been eliminated, but because the world has proven itself predictable enough to trust for a while. And so you sink further into sleep, letting the long pause carry you, knowing that when you wake again, the night will be nearly over, and the wolves, wherever they are now, will already be turning back into shadows of memory, rather than present concern. You wake to the absence of something rather than its presence. It takes a moment to understand what is missing. Then it settles. The howls, the distant movement, the sense of attention beyond the walls, all of it has thinned to nothing. Silence now feels different than it did earlier. It is not heavy. It is not expectant. It feels finished, like the final page of a chapter that has already turned itself. You remain still listening out of habit rather than need. The cabin responds with the same quiet cues it has offered all night. The fire breathes faintly. Wood holds its shape. Breath rises and falls nearby. Nothing new presses inward. This is the hour when many frontier diaries mention relief without celebration. People did not announce safety. They noticed it gradually through absence. The absence of sound, the absence of tension, the absence of that subtle feeling of being observed. There is a grounded historical reality beneath this moment. Wolves are crepuscular by nature, most active around dusk and dawn, but not continuously through the night. Their activity rises and falls in waves, shaped by energy, weather, and opportunity. Long periods of silence were common, especially after exploration or communication had passed. Knowing this did not always calm people, but experiencing it. You sense now that whatever interest the forest had in the cabin earlier has fully moved on. Attention has scattered back into the wider landscape. That shift feels unmistakable. You take a slow breath, deeper than any you have taken since nightfall. The breath expands your chest, fully unguarded. That alone tells you something important. Your body believes the moment has changed. The fire's glow is faint, but it no longer feels vulnerable. Embers pulse quietly, steady enough to last until morning tending. Their persistence mirrors your own. A small, almost forgotten belief surfaces now. Some settlers claimed the final howl of the night carried meaning, that when wolves fell silent after a period of calling, it signaled completion rather than threat. The idea was poetic rather than scientific, but it gave people a way to interpret silence as resolution instead of suspense. You think of the last howl you heard hours ago, how it faded rather than cut off, how it was answered and then followed by quiet. That sequence feels complete now, like a conversation that has ended. There has been ongoing discussion among scholars about whether people anthropomorphize wolf behavior to make sense of it. Some argue that interpreting patterns as intention helped people feel less powerless. Others suggest that such interpretations were practical shorthand for observed behavior. Wolves moved in ways that felt purposeful because they were. The debate remains open. From here, interpretation feels unnecessary. The silence stands on its own. You notice how relaxed your jaw feels, how loose your hands are beneath the blanket. These small details tell you more than thoughts ever could. The nervous system has shifted. Vigilance has released its grip. Outside, if anything moves, it does so beyond your awareness. Snow muffles the forest into stillness. The clearing feels empty, even if it is not. That emptiness is a gift. You think briefly of how this moment will be remembered later. Not as drama, but as the point where nothing happened, where fear simply dissolved without needing to be confronted. These moments rarely make stories, yet they are the ones that allowed people to continue. A curious detail from the period drifts into your mind. Some families mark this hour by stirring the fire, just slightly, not to build it, but to acknowledge the passing of the night. A small gesture of recognition. We made it through. Whether this was widespread or localized is unclear, but the idea resonates. Acknowledgement matters. You do not move to stir the embers now. The acknowledgement happens internally. Your breath deepens again. That is enough. There has been thoughtful disagreement among historians about how often frontier families actually felt relief versus lingering anxiety as night ended. Some accounts suggest fear did not fully lift until daylight. Others describe a palpable easing well before sunrise. The difference likely depended on experience. Familiarity breeds confidence. You feel that confidence now, quiet and unremarkable. Wolves no longer occupy your thoughts. They have returned to abstraction, part of the broader wilderness rather than specific presences. The cabin feels larger now, as if walls have pushed outward slightly. That illusion comes from relaxation. Tension contracts space, calm expands it. You remain still, not wanting to break this moment prematurely. There is no rush. Morning will come whether you move or not. For now, stillness feels earned. Another long breath passes through you, and with it the last trace of the night's edge slips away. You are no longer listening for confirmation, you have it. The fire shifts softly, embers settling deeper. The sound blends into background awareness without drawing attention. Familiarity has dulled its sharpness. You feel sleep returning again, but this time it carries a different quality. It is not defensive, it is not watchful, it is complete. This final stretch of night sleep is often described as the deepest. After vigilance fades, the body claims its reward. Muscles release fully, thoughts dissolve, awareness thins to almost nothing. You allow yourself to sink into that depth without resistance. There is no reason to stay on the surface now. The night has finished its work. If wolves exist anywhere near the cabin at this moment, they no longer matter. They have resumed their lives elsewhere, shaped by hunger and weather and instinct. Their role in your night has ended. The forest has turned its attention inward. The cabin has proven itself sufficient. The balance has held. You drift fully under, carrying none of the earlier tension with you. What remains is warmth, weight, and the quiet knowledge that you have passed through something without needing to conquer it. The silence wraps around you now, not as threat but as conclusion. And in that gentle finality, you rest more deeply than you have all night, letting the hours before dawn carry you without interruption toward the morning that is already beginning to gather beyond the trees. Sleep carries you farther this time, into a place where thought dissolves into impression. Wolves no longer appear as animals or sounds. They become shapes woven into dreams, fragments of movement without urgency or edge. You do not chase them. They pass through and fade, leaving behind only the feeling of having been part of a larger landscape. Your mind does what it always does when tension finally releases. It sorts experience into memory. Not carefully, not chronologically. It gathers impressions and files them away without asking permission. The crackle of the fire, the hush of snow, the sense of closeness that never became danger. This is how nights like this survive in people's lives. Not as events, but as textures. There is a widely acknowledged pattern in historical sleep. Accounts that dreams often followed periods of fear or vigilance. Once the nervous system no longer needed to stay alert, the mind replayed the night in softened form. Threats appeared, but they were distant. Sounds were present, but muted. The mind processed what the body had endured, smoothing sharp edges before storing them away. You feel that process now. Dreams drift through you slowly, not vivid enough to wake you, not heavy enough to disturb. Wolves appear briefly, then dissolve into trees. Trees dissolve into shadows. Shadows dissolve into warmth. Your body lies still heavy and relaxed. Breathing is deep and regular, now the kind of breath that only comes when vigilance has truly ended. The cold still exists, but your awareness of it has dulled. Sensation has shifted from alertness to background presence. Somewhere between dream and wakefulness, you sense the cabin again, but differently. It feels larger, more stable, as if the walls have settled more firmly into the earth. The fire no longer feels like a boundary. It feels like a companion that has done its work and now rests alongside you. There has been thoughtful discussion among historians about how memory reshapes fear after the fact. Some argue that danger becomes exaggerated over time, sharpened by retelling. Others suggest the opposite, that fear softens as survival becomes the dominant narrative. People remember what they endured, not what nearly happened. The truth likely depends on the teller and the audience. From inside this half-dream, you sense that this night will not become a dramatic story. It will become a quiet reference point, a memory of how the night felt rather than what it threatened. Your dreams shift again. You see the clearing from above, snow smoothing the ground into pale shapes. Tracks cross and fade. Nothing lingers long enough to matter. The forest feels wide, unconcerned, alive in its own rhythm. A subtle warmth spreads through your chest as your body reaches its deepest rest of the night. Muscles release fully now. Jaw slackens, hands loosen completely. There is no more readiness left to maintain. This deepest stretch of sleep is often described in frontier journals as the reward of endurance. After hours of listening and waiting, the body claimed a rest so complete, it erased fatigue for a time. It did not last long, but it was enough. You feel that reward now. Sleep thickens around you, blurring the line between self and space. You are no longer aware of the wolves as separate entities. They exist only as part of the larger night that has already passed. There is an interesting detail noted in some historical accounts. People often dreamed of daylight after nights of heightened alertness. Not of danger, but of ordinary morning tasks, walking outside, cooking, tending fires, hearing familiar sounds. These dreams anchored the mind forward toward continuation rather than threat. Your dreams follow that pattern. You sense morning without seeing it. A grey light, the sound of someone stirring embers, the faint promise of movement and warmth returning. These impressions drift through without pulling you fully awake. Another scholarly discussion surfaces faintly at the edge of awareness. Some researchers suggest that such dreams served a regulatory function, helping the mind transition from vigilance to routine. Others view them as simple wish fulfillment. Either way, the effect is calming. The future feels predictable again. Your breathing remains deep and even. The cabin is quiet except for the softest sounds of settling wood. No one moves. No one needs to. Outside, if wolves move at all, they do so beyond your dreams. They have receded fully into abstraction, no longer part of your immediate experience. The forest belongs to itself again. You drift through this deepest sleep without interruption. Time loses its meaning. Minutes stretch or vanish. The night continues, but you are no longer walking alongside it. You are being carried. When awareness briefly brushes the surface again, it does so gently without urgency. You register warmth near the hearth, the faint smell of smoke, the reassuring weight of blankets. These sensations pass without pulling you awake. Your mind accepts them and lets go again. This is the kind of sleep people rarely talk about because it leaves little memory. It does not announce itself, it does not linger, it simply restores. There has been debate among historians about how restorative frontier sleep truly was, given its frequent interruptions. Some argue it could never compare to modern rest. Others suggest that adaptation created its own form of balance. Bodies learned to extract recovery from imperfect conditions. Lying here, you sense that balance at work. You do not need perfect sleep, you need enough. Your dreams thin, further dissolving into sensation. Warmth, weight, stillness. The mind empties itself of images and holds only feeling. This is the point where night and morning begin to overlap, without your knowledge. Darkness remains, but its authority has ended. The long stretch behind you has already resolved. You rest now without thought, without fear, without expectation. The night has been absorbed into the body, processed, stored and released. And as you remain in this deep, untroubled sleep, the last traces of wolves of listening, of waiting fade entirely. What remains is simply rest, quiet and complete, carrying you gently forward toward the moment when you awake not to danger, but to continuity. The ordinary miracle of another morning in a world that has once again allowed you to sleep through the dark. You wake again, but this time it feels different. Not abrupt, not cautious, just a gentle resurfacing, like drifting upward through water, rather than breaking through it. Your eyes remain closed, yet you already know something important. The night no longer has teeth. The first thing you notice is sound, or rather the quality of it. The forest is not silent, but it has changed tone. The sharp edges are gone. What remains is diffuse and ordinary. Wind somewhere far off, snow settling without urgency. The world sounds busy in a daytime way, even though daylight has not arrived yet. This shift was well known to people who lived close to predators. They understood that animals like wolves avoided lingering near human shelters once curiosity or communication had passed. The wilderness did not revolve around cabins. It flowed past them. Most nights ended not with confrontation, but with dispersal. You breathe deeply, unguarded now. The breath fills your chest fully, without triggering alertness. That alone tells you the most dangerous part of the night psychologically, at least has passed. Your body feels heavier than before, grounded rather than tense. Muscles rest fully against the bedding. The cold still exists, but it no longer demands negotiation. It has become background condition like gravity. Outside there are no howls, no footfalls, no sense of proximity. If wolves were ever close, they have withdrawn completely, now following paths that have nothing to do with you. This pattern appears again and again in historical accounts. Wolves explored, wolves communicated, then wolves moved on. There is a fascinating observation recorded in several frontier journals. People often wrote that mornings felt safer than nights, not because danger was gone, but because clarity returned. Shapes became visible, sounds had sources, fear shrank when the unknown did. You sense that clarity approaching now, even before light. The night feels legible again, predictable. The forest no longer feels like an active participant in your thoughts. There has been long-standing discussion among historians about whether wolves deliberately avoided dawn activity near human dwellings, or whether human perception simply shifted with the light. Some argue animals changed behavior to avoid humans becoming active. Others suggest people felt safer simply because they could see again. The truth likely lies somewhere between biology and perception. Either way, dawn mattered. You lie still appreciating this liminal moment. The fire remains low, but alive. Embers glow faintly, steady enough to last until someone stirs them. The smell of smoke is softer now, no longer sharp. It blends with the scent of damp wood and cold air. A small, almost endearing belief from the period floats into your awareness. Some settlers claimed wolves disliked the hour before dawn because it belonged to neither night nor day. The idea was more poetic than factual, but it gave meaning to the transition. Boundaries, even temporal ones, made people feel safer. You smile faintly at that thought. Whether or not wolves cared, you do. This hour feels like release. Your thoughts drift toward practicalities without urgency. Morning tasks, stirring the fire, checking animals, stepping outside to see what the night left behind. These thoughts are calm and linear, a stark contrast to the looping vigilance of earlier hours. You notice how your mind no longer jumps to worst-case scenarios. Wolves do not appear in these morning thoughts. They have lost their hold. What remains is continuation. Another scholarly debate surfaces briefly, one that now feels distant. Some researchers argue that early settlers overstated predator danger to justify cautionary practices. Others maintain that underestimating danger was far more costly. From inside the experience, the argument feels beside the point. Fear served its purpose when it needed to. Now it has stepped aside. Your breathing remains deep and easy. The nervous system has fully downshifted. There is no readiness left to maintain. Outside, the forest prepares for daylight in its own way. Birds remain quiet for now, but you sense them gathering. The air feels subtly different, less stagnant. The world is turning. You allow yourself to stay still, savouring this last pocket of darkness without tension. This is not the night you feared. This is the night you survived quietly. You think briefly of the wolves again, but they appear now only as distant facts rather than felt presences. Animals following instinct. Lives intersecting briefly and then diverging. Nothing personal, nothing intentional. There is a grounded historical understanding that most frontier nights ended exactly like this. With relief, not expressed danger, not confirmed, and life resuming without commentary. Survival rarely announced itself. It simply continued. You feel that continuation now, steady and unremarkable. The cabin feels solid. The ground feels supportive rather than draining. The cold feels manageable. Your eyes remain closed, but you are fully awake now, resting in the certainty that the hardest part is over. Morning has not arrived yet, but it no longer needs to. The night has already released you. You take another slow breath deeper than the last and let it out with ease. Whatever watched or listened or passed through the forest earlier is gone. The clearing belongs to stillness now. In this moment before dawn, wrapped in fading darkness and returning calm, you understand something simple and enduring. Most fears do not end with confrontation. They end by losing relevance. And as you rest in that understanding, waiting quietly for the first hint of light to touch the cabin walls, the memory of wolves howling outside fades into something manageable. A story you will later remember, not for what happened, but for how you learned you could sleep through it. You notice slowly that the sense of togetherness inside the cabin has changed. Earlier in the night, it was deliberate, almost strategic. Bodies arranged for warmth, breathing synchronized for reassurance. Now it feels more natural, less intentional. The shared space has relaxed along with you. This is how communal fear transforms into communal calm. No one announces it, no signal is given. It simply happens when nothing bad follows the tension that came before. You lie still and feel the presence of others, not as protection, but as quiet companionship. Each body nearby has sunk deeper into rest, trusting the night enough to let go. That trust spreads without effort. It is difficult to stay anxious when everyone else has already moved on. There is a broadly recognized historical pattern here. Frontier families relied on group presence, not only for physical safety, but for emotional regulation. Shared space allowed fear to circulate and dissipate rather than stagnate. Isolation intensified anxiety. Togetherness diluted it. You feel that dilution now. Whatever remained of your earlier vigilance has thinned to almost nothing. The wolves are no longer a point of focus. They have become background knowledge, like the fact that winter exists, or that the fire will eventually need tending. Inside the cabin, the air feels warmer than before, though the fire has not changed. That warmth comes from bodies that are fully relaxed, releasing tension and heat back into the shared space. Human warmth is different from fire warmth. It is softer, more even, less demanding. A small sound reaches you, barely noticeable. Someone murmurs in their sleep, a half-formed word without meaning. The sound is gentle, almost reassuring. It signals deep rest, the kind that only comes when the mind feels safe enough to wander. You notice how far you have come from the start of the night. Then every sound demanded interpretation. Every silence invited speculation. Now sounds pass through awareness, without attaching themselves to thought. That change feels earned. There has been thoughtful debate among historians about whether communal living reduced fear by providing actual safety or whether it simply changed perception. Some argue numbers deterred predators. Others suggest the primary benefit was psychological. Fear shared is fear halved. From where you lie, the distinction feels irrelevant. The effect is what matters. Your breathing remains deep and slow. The cold no longer creeps aggressively. It exists, but your body has adapted. Heat loss has stabilized. Comfort has found its equilibrium. Another curious observation from historical accounts surfaces quietly. Many settlers wrote that nights felt longer when fear was shared silently, and shorter when it was acknowledged and released. Fear thrives on being held privately. It weakens when allowed to circulate. You sense that release now, as if something has drained away from the room. The cabin feels lighter, less crowded by thought. Outside, the forest remains still. Wolves do not return to your mind even when you think of the outside world. That absence feels telling. Attention has shifted, the night has moved on. You find yourself thinking of later, not in anticipation, but in continuity. Morning tasks will happen, fires will be stirred, animals checked, footprints discovered or erased by snow, life will resume without commentary on the night just past. This quiet normalcy is the true outcome of survival. Not relief expressed loudly, but continuity accepted calmly. There is an understated historical reality that most frontier families did not recount uneventful nights in detail. Diaries mention Storm's illness loss. Ordinary endurance was rarely recorded, and yet those ordinary nights were the foundation of everything else. You feel yourself becoming part of that unrecorded pattern. This night will not stand out in memory as danger faced or conquered. It will stand as an example of how fear rose and then faded without demanding action. The presence of others nearby now feels almost abstract. You no longer need to track breathing or movement. Their stillness is assumed. Trust has replaced monitoring. Your body responds by sinking deeper into the bedding, heavy and warm. Muscles relax fully. There is no readiness left to maintain. Another scholarly discussion floats faintly through your thoughts. Some researchers suggest that communal calm created a feedback loop. When one person relaxed, others followed. Calm spread faster than fear when conditions allowed. From inside the cabin, that loop feels complete now. Everyone has arrived at rest. You do not feel triumphant, you feel ordinary, and that ordinariness feels profound. Outside, the forest exists independently of your thoughts. Wolves move or sleep or hunt elsewhere. Their lives continue without intersecting yours any further tonight. That separation feels final. You allow your eyes to remain closed though you are fully awake. This is not vigilance, it is contentment. The kind that arrives quietly after tension has resolved itself. You take another slow breath and let it out without effort. The cabin holds. The night releases its last claim on your attention. In this shared calm, you understand something deeply simple. Safety is not always the absence of danger. Sometimes it is the absence of urgency. And with urgency gone, you rest again, not because you must, but because you can. When you think back on the night now, even before it has fully ended, you notice how different memory already feels from experience. What once felt sharp has begun to blur. What felt enormous has quietly shrunk. Fear does not vanish all at once. It reorganizes itself, filing edges away, turning sensations into something easier to hold. This is one of the strange gifts of hindsight. The moment you are no longer inside the threat, your mind begins to resize it. People on the frontier lived with this contrast constantly. Nights were endured one breath at a time, mornings reframed them. By daylight, what felt overwhelming in darkness often seemed manageable, even ordinary. The danger did not disappear, perspective did. There is a well-established observation in historical accounts that settlers spoke differently about events after time had passed. Journals written days later sound calmer than entries written by lamplight in the moment. Language softened, certainty increased, memory edited. You feel that editing process beginning now, even before dawn. The wolves that once occupied so much mental space are already becoming less defined. You remember sound more than threat, distance more than proximity. The sense of being watched has thinned into a vague recollection rather than a living sensation. This shift is not denial, it is survival. The mind cannot carry constant urgency and continue functioning. It must archive. You notice how your body feels compared to earlier hours. There is no tightness in your shoulders, no need to listen actively. Even when you think about the forest outside, your heart rate does not change. The body has accepted that this chapter has closed. A practical historical reality underlies this response. Frontier families could not afford to relive fear endlessly. Anxiety consumed energy needed for labor decision-making and care. Moving forward required emotional efficiency. Nights were survived, days were worked, dwellings served no one. That does not mean fear was forgotten. It was simply placed in context. You think briefly of how this night might be described later, perhaps as a mention. Wolves heard in the distance. Snow fell. Nothing came of it. A single line in a letter, if that. The experience itself will not be fully conveyed. It rarely is. There has been long-standing debate among historians about whether such understatement masked trauma or reflected resilience. Some argue frontier people suppressed fear because acknowledging it carried stigma. Others suggest fear was acknowledged privately, but not centered publicly, because it did not alter outcomes. The evidence supports both interpretations. Human response is rarely uniform. From inside your own experience, understatement feels less like suppression and more like proportionality. The night mattered, but it did not define you. You lie still and feel the cabin around you as a fixed presence again. Earlier it felt thin and permeable. Now it feels solid, grounded, reliable. That change has not come from the structure itself. It has come from your perception of it. The fire remains low but stable. No one has risen to tend it yet. There is no urgency. That alone signals safety more clearly than any thought could. Outside, the forest is quiet in a way that suggests conclusion rather than anticipation. Even if something moves, it does not register. Attention has withdrawn fully. A curious historical detail comes to mind. Some settlers wrote that they judged the danger of a night by how quickly they could stop thinking about it afterward. Nights that lingered in thought were rare. Most faded quickly. This fading was not forgetfulness. It was adaptation. You feel that adaptation at work now. The night is already slipping behind you. Your thoughts turn briefly to the idea of wolves in general rather than wolves tonight. Animals with patterns, animals with boundaries, animals whose lives intersected briefly with yours and then diverged. That abstraction feels safe. It removes immediacy. There has been thoughtful disagreement among scholars about whether wolves were more feared than other dangers because they represented intention rather than accident. Weather happened. Illness happened. Wolves chose. That perception of choice made them more unsettling. And yet, as knowledge accumulated, wolves became less mysterious. Patterns replaced imagination. You sense that shift now. Knowledge has softened fear into respect rather than dread. You take another slow breath, noticing how natural it feels. Breathing no longer serves as regulation. It simply happens. That is perhaps the clearest sign that vigilance has ended. The cabin creaks softly as temperature shifts again. This time the sound feels almost friendly. Familiar noises regain their neutral status once fear recedes. You think briefly of how many times this same pattern has repeated across history. A night of tension, a morning of calm, the cycle continuing until it becomes unremarkable. Survival often looks repetitive rather than dramatic. Another scholarly discussion surfaces faintly. Some researchers argue that modern people misinterpret frontier fear because they imagine it as constant terror. In reality, fear came in waves interspersed with long stretches of normalcy. Those stretches mattered more. They allowed life to continue. You feel that normalcy returning now, settling gently over the cabin. Your body sinks a little deeper into the bedding, not out of exhaustion, but out of comfort. The difference is subtle, but real. Exhaustion collapses, comfort settles. You realize you could fall asleep again easily now, not out of necessity, but because rest feels natural. There is no internal argument to stay awake, no reason to listen harder. The wolves once so present have been reduced to a concept rather than an experience. That reduction feels complete. You let your eyes remain closed, enjoying the stillness without expectation. Morning will come soon enough. There is nothing to prepare for in this moment. The night has done what nights often do. It has tested awareness, demanded patience, and then released its grip without ceremony. You have moved through it without incident. And as the memory of tension continues to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of continuity, you understand something that many before you learned the same way. Fear feels largest when it is happening. Survival feels quiet afterward. You rest in that quiet now, knowing that when the story of this night is told, if it is told at all, it will sound smaller than it felt. And that is not dishonesty, that is perspective. With that understanding settling gently into place, you allow yourself to drift again, fully at ease, carrying forward not the fear of wolves, but the calm knowledge that you slept through their presence, and the world once again carried on. Sleep returns easily now, almost eagerly, as if your body has been waiting for permission it no longer needs to ask for. The difference between this rest and earlier stretches is unmistakable. There is no edge to it, no listening beneath listening, just weight and warmth and the quiet acceptance of being exactly where you are. You sink deeper into the bedding, feeling the way fabric molds gently around your shape. The earth beneath no longer feels like an adversary stealing heat. It feels solid, dependable, something to rest on, rather than resist. The cold remains, but it has been negotiated into the background, stripped of its urgency. This is exhaustion, giving way to recovery. People who lived through nights like this often described a moment when the body simply surrendered, not to fear but to rhythm. The rhythm of fire breathing low, the rhythm of shared sleep, the rhythm of the night itself finally slowing. Once that rhythm took over, rest followed naturally. You feel it now. Your breathing has found its own pace, deeper and slower than before. Each inhale arrives without effort. Each exhale carries a soft sense of release, as if your body is setting something down it no longer needs to carry. Outside, the forest has receded fully from your awareness, not because it has disappeared, but because it no longer requires attention. Wolves, weather, distance, uncertainty, all exist beyond the edges of your mind now, like facts written on a page you are no longer reading. There is a simple historical truth that becomes clear in moments like this. Most frontier nights ended quietly. The danger people prepared for did not arrive. The vigilance they maintained was rarely rewarded with action, and yet that vigilance mattered. It allowed the quiet ending. Historians have long debated whether this constant readiness drained people or strengthened them. Some argue it imposed a slow toll, wearing down bodies and minds over years. Others suggest it cultivated resilience, a capacity to endure uncertainty without collapsing. The reality was likely both. Endurance often carries a cost, but it also builds skill. You feel that skill now in how easily you are resting. The body has learned when to let go. It recognizes this hour as a place of safety, not because danger has been eliminated, but because patterns have resolved. A faint sound from inside the cabin drifts into your awareness and then passes without consequence. Someone shifts, fabric brushes wood. The sound does not pull you up toward wakefulness. It folds seamlessly into the texture of sleep. That is new. Earlier, any change invited analysis. Now change is simply absorbed. The nervous system has completed its cycle. Alertness has done its job and stepped aside. You drift through images that barely qualify as dreams. Warmth spreading, light touching wood. The sense of movement without direction. These impressions come and go without narrative. They do not ask to be remembered. Another historical observation aligns quietly with this experience. Frontier diaries often describe the deepest sleep arriving just before dawn, after the longest hours of darkness had passed. This sleep was brief but restorative, a final gift from the night before the work of day began again. You are in that gift now. Your body grows heavier, still sinking into a state where awareness thins almost completely. Muscles that held tension unconsciously all night finally release. Shoulders soften fully. Jaw loosens. Hands curl slightly inward, not in defense but in comfort. There is no fear left to manage. Not because it was defeated, but because it has fulfilled its purpose and gone quiet. The wolves once central to your thoughts are now absent, even as ideas. They have been folded into memory and filed away without ceremony. Their howls, so vivid earlier, have become distant echoes no longer attached to sensation. This is how most nights ended on the frontier, not with triumph, not with confrontation, with forgetting. There has been scholarly discussion about whether forgetting was a necessary part of survival. Some argue that memory had to soften danger to allow people to face the next night. Others suggest forgetting was selective, preserving only what was useful. Either way, the mind did not hold on to every fear. It could not afford to. You feel that selective forgetting happening now. What remains is not fear but competence. The quiet knowledge that you passed through something and came out the other side intact. Your breathing deepens further, so slow and even, it barely registers. Time dissolves. Minutes stretch or vanish entirely. You're no longer tracking progression. The concept of night itself fades. Outside, the forest continues its own rhythms, indifferent and alive. Wolves move rest or hunt somewhere beyond your awareness. Their lives continue without intersecting yours any further. The boundary holds not because it is enforced, but because paths have diverged. The cabin feels almost weightless now, despite its solid walls. Or perhaps you feel weightless within it. The distinction no longer matters. You are supported. Another wave of sleep carries you deeper still. This one has no edges at all. Awareness dissolves completely, leaving only sensation, and then even sensation fades. There is a quiet completeness to this rest. It does not demand duration, it does not promise renewal. It simply exists, doing what sleep has always done best, repairing without announcement. If you were to wake later and try to pinpoint the moment fear ended, you would not be able to. It slipped away without sound or signal, leaving no clear line behind it. That is how most fear ends, not with resolution, but with irrelevance. You rest now in that irrelevance. The night has lost its authority. It continues, but it does not matter. Your body has reclaimed the time for itself. This final stretch of sleep carries you gently, uninterrupted, toward the threshold of morning. You do not sense that approach yet. You do not need to. For now, there is only rest. Deep, untroubled, and sufficient. The kind that comes not from safety, guaranteed, but from uncertainty, endured. And as you remain in this state, breathing slow and steady, wrapped in shared warmth and familiar stillness, you embody the quiet truth of countless nights before you. That survival often looks exactly like this. No drama, no memory. Just sleep arriving at last and carrying you forward without asking anything in return. You wake not to sound, but to light that is not quite light yet. A thin, grey presence presses gently against your closed eyes, filtering through cracks and seams, changing the colour of darkness rather than replacing it. Morning has begun its quiet work. Your body recognises this before your mind does. Breathing shifts, muscles stir without urgency. The deep sleep that carried you through the last stretch loosens naturally like a tide turning without drama. This is how dawn arrives on the frontier. Not suddenly, not brightly, it seeps. People who lived through long winters learned to read this moment with precision. They could tell how close morning was by the quality of grey, by the way sound returned to the world, by how cold behaved differently when the night's grip began to weaken. This awareness came from repetition rather than instruction. You feel it now without knowing how you know. The cabin feels different in this half-light. Larger, less compressed. Shadows retreat into corners where they belong. The walls no longer feel like barriers holding something out. They feel like boundaries marking where you are. You lie still listening again, but the listening has changed character. It is no longer searching, it is receiving. Outside, the forest stirs in small, tentative ways, not with the urgency of night predators, but with the careful testing of morning life. A branch settles. Snow shifts under its own weight. Somewhere far off, something moves with purpose rather than caution. Wolves do not announce themselves now. Whatever howling occurred earlier belongs to a different chapter. This matches many historical observations. Wolves were most vocal under cover of darkness. As light approached, activity shifted. Packs moved away from human areas or settled into rest, conserving energy for the next cycle. There has been persistent disagreement among researchers about whether this withdrawal was deliberate avoidance of humans or simply coincidence of natural rhythm. Some argue wolves adapted their behaviour in response to human activity patterns. Others maintain their cycles remained largely independent. The evidence remains mixed. What matters here is the result: silence. You stretch slightly, testing sensation. Limbs feel stiff but not painful. The cold left its mark, but it did not win. Your body endured the night without complaint. That realization feels grounding. The fire glows faintly now, barely more than a suggestion of warmth. Embers hold together long enough to be coaxed back to life soon. Their persistence mirrors the night you have just passed. Quiet, uneventful, sufficient. A small, almost charming detail from frontier life drifts into your awareness. Some families believe that if the fire survived the night without needing attention, the household would have good fortune that day. The belief was not universal, but it reflected gratitude for continuity. Surviving the night intact mattered. You feel that gratitude now, even if you do not name it. Your thoughts move naturally toward the outside world. You imagine stepping out later, seeing the clearing as it truly is. Snow undisturbed or crossed by tracks. Evidence of life that passed nearby without intersecting yours. That moment will come soon enough. For now, you stay still, letting the last fragments of sleep dissolve gently. There is no urgency to rise. Morning tasks will wait for full light. The cabin creaks softly as temperature begins to shift again. Wood responds to warmth, as it did to cold, expanding, just enough to be felt. The sound is familiar, almost comforting. It means the structure is alive, responsive. There has been scholarly discussion about whether dawn truly reduced danger or merely changed perception. Some argue daylight provided real safety by improving visibility and coordination. Others suggest it simply gave people confidence. From where you lie, the distinction feels academic. Confidence itself changes experience. You feel confident now, not in a bold way, but in a settled one. The night no longer occupies you. It has already become past. Your breathing remains slow but wakeful. Awareness sharpens slightly without edge. You can feel the weight of your body again, the texture of fabric, the firmness of the ground beneath. Sensation returns without threat. Outside, the forest belongs to morning rhythms now. If wolves exist anywhere near the cabin, they are part of that broader pattern rather than singular presences. Their howls, once vivid, have no place in this light. You think briefly of how different everything feels compared to the start of the night. Then darkness magnified uncertainty. Now light shrinks it. Nothing has changed materially. The forest is the same. The wolves are the same. You are the same. And yet everything feels altered. This is the quiet power of morning. There is a simple historical reality beneath this shift. Most frontier families measured survival in mornings, reached not dangers avoided. Each dawn was confirmation that what had been done was enough. You feel that confirmation now, settling gently over you. You remain still a moment longer, letting the grey deepen, letting the night fully release its hold. There is no rush to move. The hardest part has already passed. Soon someone will stir the fire. Someone will rise carefully, stretching stiff limbs, listening briefly to the world outside before opening the door. Life will resume in ordinary ways. For now, you rest in the threshold between night and day, aware that the wolves you listened to hours ago have already become memory rather than presence. And as the light grows stronger, quietly, patiently, you understand something that countless people understood, the same way before you. You did not conquer the night. You lived through it. That is enough. The first true signs of morning arrive not with light, but with intention. Somewhere nearby, a body shifts in a way that suggests waking rather than turning. Breath changes rhythm. A hand moves deliberately instead of unconsciously. The cabin begins to wake itself. You remain still, listening as awareness spreads quietly through the space. No one speaks yet. Speech feels unnecessary this early. The world is being assessed through smaller signals first. This moment was deeply familiar to people living on the frontier. Before doors were opened or fires stirred, there was always a pause, a listening pause, a brief check to confirm that night had ended cleanly. It was not superstition. It was prudence shaped by habit. You feel the difference in your body immediately. Muscles engage slightly, not with tension but with readiness, the kind that belongs to morning rather than danger. The mind begins to organize itself around tasks instead of possibilities. Outside, the forest offers its first daytime cues. Snow reflects what little light there is, lifting the darkness just enough to reveal shape without detail. Distance becomes readable again. Sound gains direction. What was once ambiguous now feels anchored. Wolves do not feature in this assessment at all. They have slipped fully into abstraction, into the category of things that exist but do not require thought. That transition feels complete. There is a well-documented observation in many frontier accounts that fear often vanished abruptly at morning, replaced not by relief but by practicality. People did not linger on what might have happened. They focused on what needed to be done. Fires were coaxed back to strength. Animals were checked. Water was fetched. Life resumed. You sense that shift now. Your thoughts move naturally toward action, without anxiety. Even the idea of stepping outside feels neutral rather than charged. Curiosity replaces vigilance. A subtle but telling detail comes to mind. Some settlers described morning silence as proof that the night had resolved itself. Wolves that passed nearby did not linger into daylight. The absence of sound became confirmation that paths had diverged. There has been ongoing discussion among historians about whether this sense of resolution was accurate or simply comforting. Some argue predators were just as dangerous at dawn. Others suggest that increased visibility and human activity genuinely reduced risk. The truth likely lies in the interaction between perception and behavior. Feeling safe changes how one moves. Movement changes outcomes. You notice how upright your breathing feels now. Fuller, more open. The chest expands without restraint. That physical change tells you more than any thought could. The body has declared the night finished. The fire is stirred gently, somewhere nearby. Embers respond with a low, satisfied sound. Light strengthens slightly, stretching shadows thinner. Warmth begins to spread more evenly through the cabin. This simple act feels ceremonial, even if it is not treated as such. A curious frontier saying surfaces faintly in your thoughts. If the fire greets the morning the house has held, it was not meant poetically, it was practical gratitude. Fire meant warmth. Warmth meant life. You feel that gratitude now without attaching words to it. The cabin, which felt so enclosed earlier, now feels like a shelter that did its job. The walls are no longer barriers. They are context. They mark where you spent the night, not what you were protected from. Outside, the forest begins to separate itself into elements. Trees stand distinct from one another. Snow shows texture. Tracks may or may not be visible. That discovery will come later. There has been scholarly debate about how much frontier fear of predators was rooted in darkness rather than danger. Some suggest that daylight dissolved fear because it restored control and predictability. Others argue fear was always present, simply less felt. From your experience, darkness amplified uncertainty. Light restores proportion. You feel proportion returning now. Someone nearby stretches fully, joints popping softly. The sound feels ordinary, almost comforting. Ordinary sounds reclaim the space. You consider how little of the night will be carried forward. The memory of listening, the sense of proximity, the careful stillness. These will fade quickly, leaving behind only the knowledge that you endured them. That endurance does not demand reflection. It demands continuation. Your body prepares to move without haste. There is no rush. Morning has arrived on its own schedule, and it will allow you to follow it yours. You realize that if you tell this story later, it will sound simple. Wolves heard, snow fell, morning came. Nothing else happened. The telling will never fully capture the texture of the night. It will not need to. There has been thoughtful discussion among historians about how much of frontier life is misunderstood because of this compression. Long nights reduced to single lines. Fear flattened into fact, yet survival often looks unremarkable from the outside. You feel that unremarkableness now, and it feels like success. You take one last moment to lie still, absorbing the calm that has replaced vigilance completely. The night has no hold on you anymore. It has already been set aside. Soon you will rise, the door will open, cold air will rush in sharp but manageable. The world will reveal itself without threat. For now you rest in this brief space between stillness and movement, aware that what once felt like danger has already become past. And as you prepare to step fully into morning, you understand something quietly and clearly. The night did not defeat you. It simply passed as nights usually do, leaving behind nothing more than memory and the steady continuation of another day. Morning arrives not with ceremony, but with permission, the kind that feels granted rather than earned. You sense it in the way the cabin breathes differently, now in how sound carries with less distortion, in how your own body no longer feels like it must negotiate every movement. This is the final transformation of the night, not darkness into light, but tension into memory. You sit up slowly, careful with stiff muscles, and feel the weight of the hours you slept through. Not as fatigue, but as density, the kind that comes from real rest, imperfect, but sufficient. The night did not break you into pieces, it compressed you, then released you whole. There is a broadly recognized historical truth here. Frontier families judged the success of a night by its ordinariness in the morning. If tools remained where they were, if animals were quiet, if no one spoke urgently, then the night had passed as it should. Danger did not need to be disproven, it only needed to be absent. You notice that absence now. The fire is coaxed back to life. Not rushed, just encouraged. Embers brighten, smoke rises in a thin, familiar ribbon. Light strengthens along the walls, revealing nothing new, nothing damaged. The cabin looks exactly as it did before sleep, and that sameness feels like a gift. Outside, the world waits. You know that soon the door will open, and cold air will spill in sharp and clean. Tracks may or may not be there. Evidence of movement might appear or be erased by snow. Either way, the night has already finished its conversation with you. There has been long-standing debate among historians about how often wolves truly approached cabins versus how often people only believed they had. Some argue proximity was rare and memorable. Others suggest it was common but uneventful, leaving little trace. What is certain is that most encounters ended without incident. Wolves passed, people slept, life continued. That continuation is the real outcome. You think back briefly to the howls that once filled the darkness, how they seemed to press against the walls, how they pulled your attention outward. Now in daylight they feel distant, almost abstract, sound without threat, memory without urgency. This is how fear often ends. Not with resolution, but with perspective. A small, almost tender detail from frontier life comes to mind. Some families never spoke of wolves heard at night unless asked. Not out of denial, but because speaking would give the sound more weight than it deserved. Silence in the morning was a way of closing the chapter. You find yourself honouring that instinct now. The night does not require explanation. It does not need to be revisited. It has already become part of the background of living. Your body moves more freely now. Stretching feels natural. Breathing feels open. The cold that once demanded strategy now feels manageable, even bracing. You are no longer reacting, you are participating. Outside, the forest belongs to daylight logic. Shapes are clear, distance is measurable. Wolves, if they exist anywhere nearby, are simply animals moving through their own routines, no more personal than the wind or the snow. There has been thoughtful scholarly discussion about whether modern people underestimate the psychological resilience required to live this way. Nights of listening, days of labour, fear rising and falling without ever fully disappearing. Some argue it hardened people, others believe it refined them. The evidence suggests refinement. Fear did not vanish, it was integrated. You feel that integration now. The night has left you changed in a way so subtle it almost escapes notice. Not braver, not tougher, simply more aware of your own capacity to endure uncertainty without being consumed by it. You step closer to the door, hands resting briefly on the wood. It feels solid, familiar. The same door that held the night outside now opens to the day without effort. Boundaries shift as conditions change. When the door finally opens, the cold rushes in, sharp and bright. Morning air smells different. Cleaner, less layered, it clears the cabin of night in seconds. Whatever lingered of fear dissolves instantly, replaced by sensation. You step into the light. Snow reflects softly. Trees stand still. The world looks exactly as it should. No drama, no aftermath, just continuation. The night with wolves howling outside the cabin does not end with confrontation or proof. It ends like most nights ended in the 1800s. Quietly, without explanation. Folded into the long, ordinary story of surviving winter, one sleep at a time. And now as the day takes over completely, the memory of listening in the dark becomes something smaller, something manageable. A reminder not of danger, but of how you learn to rest anyway. You carry that knowledge forward, not as a warning, but as reassurance, that even when the wild speaks close to your walls, you can lie still. Breathe slowly and let sleep come when it is ready. The night has finished its work. The light grows steadier now, and with it everything softens. You do not need to think about wolves anymore. You do not need to think about walls or cold or listening. Those hours are complete, sealed gently behind you. Your breathing slows again, not from fatigue but from calm. The world feels stable, predictable enough, safe enough. If you close your eyes for a moment longer, it is not to listen, but simply to rest in the quiet that follows endurance. The kind of quiet that comes after something has passed without leaving a mark. So let your thoughts drift. Let the last traces of night fade. Let your body settle into the day without urgency. You are here. Morning is here. Everything else can wait. Sweet dreams.